Good morning, everybody. Today's date is Monday, March 23rd, 2020. This is episode 36 of Coronavirus Central, your one-stop shop for everything you wanted to know about the coronavirus and all the things you probably didn't. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We appreciate our listeners. I know you guys really enjoy listening to the information, and I'm glad to be back after a weekend off. Spent a lot of time doing some research. Spent quite a bit of time recovering. One thing I recommend to everybody is to recognize this is going to be a long marathon, not a sprint. So be sure to take time off for yourself and take care of things. It helps when you have people who can support you. Very excited that that's the case for us. T.me/coronavirus central, our open source intelligence network, up over 1,500 members now. Can get a little wild at times, I won't lie about that, but we're definitely learning a lot of information. And, amidst shutdowns and censorship, we always keep the backbone of our site at coronaviruscentral.net. That's also available at corona.castos.com. And 3 quick points before we get into the episode properly, just to cover this. It's got a lot to cover today. It's going to be some long episodes. There's just a lot happening. Today, I'm going to focus more on the United States and on Canada a little bit. Tomorrow, I'm going to go into Europe. I have news for both. It's just, if I tried to do it all in one episode, it would take me 5 hours, and while some of you would be very happy with me, others of you would not. So, and not the least of which, my throat probably can't hold out that long, although we will cover some of that on the YouTube live show at 7 p.m. this evening. So the first thing is, I want to just let people who know or do not know, Sporkle shut down our ability to have up this podcast on their platform. I received notice of that Friday morning. They gave me 1, no reason, and 2, no ability to appeal. It might be relevant that Tencent, a major Chinese company of which the People's Republic of China is a major stakeholder, is also part owner of Spotify, and that I spent a lot of time on Twitter criticizing the Chinese numbers that are being put out there. So I don't know if that's a factor. I know there are a number of people who have made efforts to get this podcast shut down for political reasons, and I understand all that. I don't know if that is a factor. It's possible. I think there's a lot of people, to be honest, who are scared of this new world that's happening, and they're looking for the comfort in the familiar of old fights. Certainly we're not doing that on this show, as you guys all know and we're listening to. And I appreciate everyone who's been on there on Apple, iTunes, on Google Play, on all the other areas that have been saying what a value this podcast has been to them. I get up and I do it for you guys, and hopefully you continue to find use in it. Just because Spotify takes it down, if you're on an Android platform, Google Play is an option. If you're on Apple, iTunes is. But if any of those go down, and they may at some point, because I'm not going to say things that are politically permissible if I think they contradict the truth. I'm just going to say what I think is true, and then you'll have to make determinations about what you agree and disagree with. And I think that's better. You can always get the podcast if you want. Download whatever podcasting app you like that just grabs them. It's called an RSS feed, and you can load the feed into it so you won't get this censored away. And the load up feed is corona.castos.com/feed. So that's the first thing I wanted to share with you. So if you ever need to find it, do that. And if you ever get confused, Twitter account at coronaviruscast. I will be happy to share information publicly if that happens again. And it will. I'm sure at some point iTunes will decide to shut this down or something else. And I know that's where most of our listeners are. So you always got to be aware. It's incumbent upon you to find your information, not look at what they're telling you. I mean, you wouldn't get the stories from me if I just went on to CNN every day or whatever site. It doesn't matter which one. You have to look at a lot of different sources. And you should, including well beyond what I'm doing. I just curate the news for you. So I wanted to share 2 other little snippets. I was watching TV last night. My wife and I have Sling, and we were watching something on A&E, and we were watching the commercials, which I thought was interesting. And I only mention this is because sometimes you can get a feel for how others are behaving by watching these secondary signs. And I was watching, there was a Hyundai ad where they were talking about, to keep sales going during the coronavirus, they would allow 6 months without payments for anyone who didn't have a job or who lost their job or was laid off or unemployed. And I thought that was really telling for some reason that, they would go 6 months, or that you saw, there was another ad, I think it was for Sprint, if I remember right, talking about all the ways in which they were helping for this virus. And I thought it was a little curious because usually, and this may or may not be right, I'm not saying that they can't do things independently and respond very quickly, especially with this level of economic triggers. But it was surprising to me because I've seen ads on those TV networks, let's say, that have been behind for like years of what's happening, yet they're right on top of the issues right now. And it kind of makes me wonder, number one, how closely business is following these disruptions, which would seem to be and logically would be very closely. But number two, the question it made me wonder is that how much of a coordinated response might be happening at levels we're not aware of, where there is this effort by a lot of different actors at that higher level of the economy to project a sort of calm to get through this. One thing we're going to talk about a lot today, especially in the last portion of the show, is the economic problem that's becoming, really, it's an experiment about how debt consumption and economics can work that has never been tried in human history, and it really makes us as individuals, as people, as nations, have a much greater say in what's going to emerge from this. There's a lot to lay into it. I don't know the outcomes. I know the problems, and I know the old system isn't going to work. Have some thoughts on the new system today. So we'll definitely get into that. And we'll spend a lot of this episode talking about the New York situation, how bad that has become, and we're going to look at some of the medical problems that are resulting, and we're using New York here as an example of what will happen in other places. I think that that's important, and I'm going to try to get a little more granular in my data, although I will not have updates on every little city or town and all the shutdowns happening. Presumably, you live in whatever town or city you live in. Local news should be adequate to get that to you. I'm trying to give you a little bit of a feel for the broad strokes of this and where it's going to go from here and the problems that you should expect, because our emphasis of this show has always been preparation and survival. So, in that vein, there's something I have to share with you guys that's utterly upsetting to me. And, I give some credit to what Washington and California have been doing, but Oregon is in a state I've talked about as much as maybe I could have, because Portland, for whatever reason, at least publicly, seems to have been spared the brunt of the outbreak as bad as Seattle or San Francisco, although I do think it is there, it is expanding, and I do think ultimately they'll get there. But this was from the Oregon Board of Nursing, okay? And this was sent out. Kate Brown is the governor over there, and here's what they are requiring in their state, and I'll just read it. This is from the Board of Nursing, the Oregon State Board of Nursing, and this is their position statement on COVID-19. All nurses in Oregon are licensed for patient care by the state. The state public health department is charged with Oregon's response to this unprecedented event. The event has also resulted in confusing and conflicting information regarding transmission, healthcare worker precautions, high-risk categorization, etc. As a state agency, the Oregon State Board of Nursing follows state-mandated procedures and will hold nurses accountable to the recommendations published by the Oregon Health Authority Public Health Division. Following World Health Organization or Center for Disease recommendations may be an organizational decision, but not an individual practitioner decision if their organization has decided to follow Oregon Public Health recommendations. If Oregon Public Health determines that a WHO or CDC guidelines to be followed, then it also becomes a recommendation of Oregon Public Health. Nurses are reminded of their social contract with the people of Oregon to care for them at their time of vulnerability and to use scientific and evidence-based criteria for determining their own risk stratification and their ability to care safely for patients. Here's the real killer line. The board has determined that nurses cannot refuse a patient care assignment because the organization, following OHA Public Health Division recommendations regarding PPE and other infection controls practices rather than WHO or CDC's guidelines. So, in case you didn't get that, what Oregon's saying is that you have to go to work even if we don't give you a mask because the state says you don't need it. This is a failure by Governor Brown. This is a betrayal of the people of Oregon, It's a sad situation that, this state is making this decision in spite of everyone else, including the US CDC, the WHO, and countries all around the world are doing this. And I have to question the motive whereby Governor Brown is allowing this. If you live in the state of Oregon, if you are a medical practitioner in the state of Oregon, especially if you're a nurse, I've had several draw my attention to this. This is utterly unacceptable that they force people. And I tell you what it's going to mean. It's going to mean people don't show up to work, right? Or people get sick. Two terrible outcomes in a time where we need something better. And I don't know why Governor Brown is doing this. I mean, if it's a lack of PPE, okay, get out there and start fixing the problem. I hope it isn't a sorry situation where this is being used as a political way to shift the buck, which I've seen some Democrats do. I've seen some Republicans do. I knock Mark DeSantis pretty much every other day on this program down in Florida. So Governor Brown, get your act together, get the nursing board together, and protect your nurses. We need them. We need all of our medical practitioners up there. So for the people in Oregon, let your governor know how unhappy you are about this. I reposted a link to this on the Twitter account at CoronavirusCast so you could see it. And I will say, if you ask nurses to do something where they're putting their life at risk, because we've read about all these healthcare workers dying, especially with exposed viral loads, that's when they don't show up. That's when you guarantee the system collapses. And you know what? I'll be honest with you, I can't blame them. Telling them they have a social contract to show up when you're telling them to go walk into death's door, that's pretty reckless. And that's pretty cynical. And, I know politics is a cynical game, but we really need better from you, Oregon. So I wanted to put that out there so that you have the opportunity to see that, because I just found that upsetting. Okay. And if that happens in any other areas, I always say to people, if you find out something more that's going on in your area, please let me know. We draw attention to these things. We want to let people know, to let policymakers know, and we've been working hard. Been working to solve problems out there, and I'm very excited about some of the networking contacts we've been able to create for people. So we're going to do a quick run through the numbers. Like I said, I'm not going to go into Europe, not that it doesn't deserve attention. I just can't fit this all in. It's going to be a challenge for me to keep not too much over 2 hours of what I have, and things are messy over there. So here are the numbers, COVID-19info.live. We are looking at this. We'll do a little F5 here to get the update for you. So we're going through here. Just give me 1 second, and we will have new numbers. And I'm taking the numbers at this point, just so you're aware, solely outside of mainland China. I just don't have a lot of faith in the Chinese numbers. With everything we're starting to see everywhere else, I have less faith as those go by. So these numbers exclude China's numbers, which are basically 90,000 dead, 3,000 deaths. Okay. So this update as of 7:10 a.m. worldwide minus China, okay, is 267,368, 12,038 deaths. That's a 4.5% rate of death. And the recovery rate as of right now is reported at 26,538, or 9.9%. And the curve looks pretty exponential. A little bit of a gap this weekend, but that's probably because a lot of countries don't report over the weekend for various different reasons. So, let's see, in South Korea is the only one going down. So all countries outside of China, Italy, 59,138 confirmed. We've gained 5,560 in the last 24 hours. 5,476 deaths. That's 651 gains of deaths. Okay, United States, we're looking at 35,224, and a lot of that's coming out of New York City. We'll talk about that. 8,477 cases in the last 24 hours, 471 deaths. That's an increase of 131. Spain, 33,089 cases. That's a gain of 4,517. 2,182 deaths. And now we've gained 462 deaths in the last 24 hours. Germany, 26,159. That's 3,030 case gains. 106 deaths. And we're looking at, that's a gain of 13 over there. So I'm really wondering why Germany's death count isn't as high as others. A lot of it, from what I understand, has to do with how they calculate things. If someone has coronavirus in Italy and is in a hospital and dies, that's treated as a death, whereas Germany has very meticulous standards. So I suspect a lot of this is caught up in funny accounting, although the Germany number is still kind of crazy low, and I'm going to try to give you a better answer tomorrow why that is the way it is. I don't like the answer I'm giving you. It's not good enough, but it's what I have. So Iran, 23,049 confirmed cases, 1,411 added to that. That number's likely low. 1,812 deaths, 127 added. Okay, France 16,257. 1,769 added to that in the last 24 hours. It's about a 10% increase there. We got 676 new deaths. That's another 114 dead. And now we'll just go real fast. These are through the countries that have over, let's say, how low do we want to go? We'll go down to the first page here. So I'm just going to give you real fast. The UK, actually we'll do it this way. South Korea, 8961, 111 deaths. Switzerland, 7776. 100 deaths. UK 5748, 282 deaths. Netherlands 4217, 180 deaths. And Belgium 3743, 88 deaths. So for all these countries that are going to follow here, all of these are under 25 deaths right now, but those numbers will start to pick up. Remember, there's a delay in this between case findings and deaths because it takes a while for people to die, especially for those who are diagnosed early and who are on ventilators, which can often extend treatment times and sort of suppresses the early death rate. So you got to be careful how much you read into all these. But just going through the numbers, Austria 3669, Norway 2385, Sweden 1934, Australia 1682, Brazil 1604, Portugal 1600, Denmark 1572, Malaysia 1518, Canada 1472. I was going down not just to give you the information, but you look at some of these countries in this list we're adding here. Take countries like Malaysia and Brazil. These are warmer weather countries. We've seen pretty big jumps in some of them, and it sort of discounts, I think, increasingly this idea that this is going to go away because of warm weather. I wouldn't count on that at all. So I think that's something we're going to definitely want to keep a very close eye on. And then, if I were to go down, there's a ton of other countries. It's getting everywhere. So just want to go real fast and let you know what states are reporting the most cases so that you have an idea. We're not going to go through every one of them, but I will go to every state that's over, let's say over 300 cases, okay? So these are the states that are currently in the U.S. And mind you, this is very difficult because a lot of states are not testing. A lot of states have different testing protocols. So be careful how much you read into any of these numbers. But this is from bnunews.com. I'm just giving you an update. This is as of, I guess it's right now. So let's see here. So U.S., it said reports 35,409 with 461 deaths and 35 reported recoveries. Remember, we have sort of different ideas of what these mean, but New York is now at 16,887 cases with 150 deaths. Washington, 1,996, 96 deaths. California, 1,802, 35 deaths. New Jersey, 1,914, 20 deaths. Illinois, 1,049, 9 deaths. Michigan, 1,035, 9 deaths. Florida, 1,007, 13 deaths. Louisiana, 837, 20 deaths. Texas, 719, 7 deaths. Massachusetts, 646, 5 deaths. Georgia, 620, 25 deaths. So we're going to have to take a closer look at Georgia here soon. Colorado, 591, 7 deaths. Tennessee, 505, 2 deaths. Pennsylvania, 479, 3 deaths. Wisconsin, 381, 4 deaths. Ohio, 351, 3 deaths. Connecticut, 327, 8 deaths. North Carolina, 307 and 0 deaths. And then there's a whole bunch of other states. There's a little bit of a cluster in the D.C. area. A lot of states in the 100s. And the lowest one is West Virginia right now with 16 in the U.S. So there you go. There's some states that are pretty low. And we have all sorts of states here. Let's see. Maine is up to 89 cases. Wow, I got to pay closer attention. So the thing that's funny about this, these numbers are low, but keep in mind that we are looking at these numbers potentially escalating every 3 to 4 days. We're looking at a doubling at this point, depending on the numbers you want to believe. And I'm not saying the numbers based upon what's being reported. I'm saying what's actually happening on the ground from places where we have better coverage of what's happening out there. President Trump put out a tweet that's worth sharing. I put a post up to it on @CoronavirusCast. Basically, the government wanted to try something where they were going to say for 15 days they wanted to practice social distancing, a mitigation separation strategy. So they put out this idea, and he had said, he tweeted 6 hours ago, as well as references in the press conference, they want to see how that's going to work. So that would delay any shutdowns, which is a choice. I don't necessarily think it's a good one, But if they keep to that 15-day interval, I would say the United States will have a lot of spreading absent local provisions being put in place between now and April 4th. So we'll have to take it at face value that that's what our government's determined to do, and I think there will be terrible consequences to that. But there is an argument out there, I guess, that's made sometimes about, some people thinking that the severity of this is far less, and, there are voices who make that argument. I am not one of them, but they're out there, and I imagine they have some ear in the administration. So hopefully, I shouldn't say hopefully, the reality is what you deal with, at least in the short term, looks to be heavily dependent upon what you have for local county, town, or state officials. Some states are being very aggressive about this. Some states are not being very aggressive, and it's interesting. It's beyond politics, just like Illinois is being pretty aggressive, Ohio, Kentucky, 3 states I know are doing well. But other states have not been. Florida has been very lax to this point, although they're starting to pick it up a little bit, as is Texas. Louisiana got hit pretty hard, I know. So, there's a really just depends where you are and what you're dealing with. And I can't tell you what to expect. I know the federal response is variable and changes all the time. It would not surprise me in the least for what I say to be invalid 3 hours from now, because they really seem to be struggling to get an idea of how they want to handle this. I don't know why that is the case, but that is in fact the case, and we're going to have to deal with that in the United States. So, sharing those informations, I wanted to read with you, this is from ProPublica. I have, what we're going to start with is a story about what COVID-19 is like in some patients, and I always put at least one of these in every episode if I find a good one, just because you deserve to hear it. I think it's very important that you have a chance to hear what this is actually like, and understand that mild is still miserable. I think it's really an important point, and we really don't know what our comorbidities are on this. I know a lot of people have been talking about chloroquine. We talked about that. We looked at other things. We've talked about remdesivir. We've talked about a number of other different drugs that are out there. But it's important to be very clear. These are not solutions for this. These are treatments that might keep you alive, that do have significant side effects. There have been a couple people who've OD'd on chloroquine. And it's important to say those things, that, also the limited availability of these drugs. And keep in mind, right now, with everyone who's getting sick, people say, oh, it's not that bad. Well, maybe. But as of this point, we only know that 0.1% of the population actually has this. And I know a lot of people say to me, well, Tom, I think I had this terrible cold or flu in December or January. Did I have it? And the answer is, I don't know. If you weren't tested, which you couldn't have been, you could have had it. You could have had the S strain that we know was here as early as January. Maybe that spread a little bit. We really don't know, and we don't know what immunity that conveys, if any. So I think you have to assume, unless you know you've had this, that you can get it. That may not be correct, but that's the safe bet in the absence of harder science and better statistics, which frankly, under these circumstances, are not going to be coming anytime soon. Anyways, the piece from ProPublica, which I think is very good, is by Lizzie Presser. It was written on the 21st here, and it goes as follows. A medical worker describes terrifying lung failure from COVID-19 even in his young patients. It first struck me how different it was when I saw my first coronavirus patient go bad. I was like, holy shit, this is not the flu. Watching this relatively young guy gasping for air, pink frothy secretions coming out of his tube. As of Friday, Louisiana was reporting 479 confirmed cases of COVID-19, one of the highest numbers in the country. 10 people had died. The majority of cases are in New Orleans, which now has one confirmed case for every 1,000 residents. New Orleans had held Mardi Gras celebrations just 2 weeks before its first patient, with more than 1 million revelers on its streets. We warned about that, but you know what happens. I spoke to a respiratory therapist there, whose job is to ensure that patients are breathing well. He works in a medium-sized city hospital intensive care unit, and they withheld his name and employer because he didn't want retaliation. They said that here in parentheses. Before the virus came to New Orleans, his days were pretty relaxed, nebulizing patients with asthma, adjusting oxygen tubes that run through the nose, or in the most severe cases, setting up and managing ventilators. His patients were usually older with chronic health conditions and bad lungs. Since last week, he's been running ventilators for the sickest COVID patients. Many are relatively young, in their 40s and 50s, and have minimal, if any, pre-existing conditions in their charts. He is overwhelmed, stunned by the manifestation of the infection, both in its speed and intensity. The ICU where he works has essentially become a coronavirus unit. He estimates that his hospital has admitted dozens of confirmed or presumptive coronavirus patients. About a third have ended up on ventilators. And I think that's really interesting, actually, the severe amount who are ending up on ventilators. That number seems to be going higher here stateside and in Europe than it was in China. His hospital had not prepared for this volume before the virus first appeared. One physician had tried to raise alarms asking about negative pressure rooms and ventilators. Most staff concluded that he was overreacting. They thought the media was overhyping it, the respiratory therapist told me. In retrospect, he was right to be concerned. He spoke to me by phone on Thursday about why exactly he has been so alarmed. His account has been condensed and edited for clarity. Quote, reading about it in the news, I knew it was going to be bad, but we deal with the flu every year, so I was thinking, well, it's probably not much worse than the flu. But seeing patients with COVID-19 totally changed my perspective, and it's a lot more frightening. I have patients in their early 40s, and I was kind of shocked. I'm seeing people who look relatively healthy with a minimal health history, and they are completely wiped out like they've been hit by a truck. This is knocking out what should be perfectly fit, healthy people. Patients will be on minimal support, on a little bit of oxygen, and then all of a sudden they go into complete respiratory arrest, shut down and can't breathe at all. We have an observation unit in the hospital, and we have been admitting patients that had tested positive or presumptive positive, those patients who had been in contact with people who were positive. We go and check vitals on patients every 4 hours, and some are on a continuous cardiac monitor, so we see that the heart rate has a sudden increase or decrease, or someone goes in and sees that the patient is struggling to breathe or is unresponsive. That seems to be what happens to a lot of these patients. They suddenly become unresponsive or go into respiratory failure. It's called acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS. That means the lungs are filled with fluid, and it's notable for the way the X-ray looks. The entire lung is basically whited out from the fluid. Patients with ARDS are extremely difficult to oxygenate. It has a really high mortality rate, about 40%. The way to manage it is to put a patient on a ventilator. The additional pressure helps the oxygen go into the bloodstream. Normally, ARDS is something that happens over time as the lungs get more and more inflamed. But with this virus, it seems like it happens overnight. When you're healthy, your lung is made up of little balloons. Like a tree made out of a bunch of little leaves, your lung is made up of little air sacs we call alveoli. When you breathe in, all of those little air sacs inflate, and they have capillaries in the walls, little blood vessels. The oxygen gets from the air in the lung into the blood so it can be carried around the body. Typically, with ARDS, the lungs become inflamed. It's like inflammation anywhere. If you have a burn on your arm, the skin around it turns red from additional blood flow. The body is sending additional nutrients to heal. The problem is when that happens in your lungs, fluid and extra blood starts going to the lungs. Viruses can injure cells in the walls of the alveoli, so the fluid leaks into the alveoli. A telltale sign of ARDS in an X-ray is what's called ground glass opacity, like an old-fashioned ground glass privacy window in a shower. And lungs look that way because fluid is white on an X-ray. So the lungs look like white ground glass, or sometimes pure white, because the lung is filled with so much fluid, displacing where the air would normally be. With our coronavirus patients, once they're on ventilators, most need about the highest settings we can do, about 90% oxygen and 16% of PEEP, which is positive end expiratory pressure, which keeps the lung inflated. So think of it like an artificial lung. That's probably sort of how to think of that. This is nearly as high as I've ever seen. The level means we're running out of options. In my experience, this severity of ARDS is usually more typical of someone who has a near-drowning experience. They have a bunch of dirty water in their lungs, or people who inhale caustic gas, especially for it to have such an acute onset like that. I've never seen a microorganism or an infectious process cause so much acute damage to the lungs so rapidly. That was what really shocked me. It first struck me how different it was when I saw my first coronavirus patient go bad. I was like, holy shit, this isn't the flu. Watching this relatively young guy gasping for air, pink frothy secretions coming out of his tube and out of his mouth. The ventilator should have been doing the work of breathing, but he was still gasping for air, moving his mouth, moving his body, struggling. We had to restrain him. With all the coronavirus patients, we've had to restrain them. They really hyperventilate. They really struggle to breathe. When you're in the mind state of struggling to breathe and delirious with fever, you don't know when someone is trying to help you. So you try to rip out the breathing tube because you feel it's choking you, but you're drowning. When someone has an infection, I'm used to seeing the normal colors you associate with it, greens and yellows. The coronavirus patients with ARDS are having a lot of secretions that are actually pink because they're filled with blood cells that are leaking into their airways. They're essentially drowning in their own blood and fluids because their lungs are so full. So we're constantly having to suction out these secretions every time we go into their rooms. Before this, we were all joking. It's grim humor. If you are exposed to the virus and test positive and go on quarantine, you get paid. We were all joking. I want to get the coronavirus because then I get a paid vacation from work. And once I saw these patients with it, I was like, holy shit, I don't want to catch this, and I don't want anyone I know to catch this. I worked a long stretch of days last week, and I watched it go from this novelty to a serious issue. We had 1 or 2 patients at our hospital, then 5 to 10, then 20. Every day the intensity kept ratcheting up, more patients, and the patients themselves are starting to get sicker and sicker. When it first started, we all had tons of equipment, tons of supplies, and as we started getting more patients, we started to run out. They had to ration supplies. At first, we were trying to use 1 mask per patient. Then it was just you get 1 mask for positive patients, another for everyone else. And now it's just you get 1 mask. I work 12-hour shifts. Right now, we are running about 4 times the number of ventilators we normally have going. We have such a large number of patients, but it's really hard to find enough people to fill the shifts. The caregiver to patient ratio has gone down, and you can't spend as much time with each patient. You can't adjust the vent settings as aggressively because you're not going to go into the room as often. And we're also trying to avoid going into the room as much as possible to reduce infection risk for staff and to conserve personal protective equipment. But we are trying to wean down the settings on the ventilator as much as possible because you don't want someone to be on the ventilator longer than they need to be. Your risk of mortality increases every day you spend on the ventilator. The high pressures from high vent settings is pushing air into the lung and can overinflate those little balloons. They can pop. It can destroy the alveoli. Even if you survive ARDS, although some damage can heal, it can also do long-lasting damage to the lungs. They can get filled up with scar tissue. ARDS can lead to cognitive decline. Some people's muscles waste away, and it takes them a long time to recover once they come off the ventilator. Or maybe they don't, and we've seen people pass over and die after they were released, presumably from loss of function, amongst other reasons. Who knows, right? There is a very real possibility we might run out of ICU beds, and at that point, I don't know what happens if patients get sick and need to be intubated and put on a ventilator. Is that person going to die because we don't have the equipment to keep them alive? What if it goes on for months and dozens of people die because we don't have the ventilators? Hopefully we don't get there, but if you only have 1 ventilator and you have 2 patients, you're going to have to go with the one who has a higher likelihood of surviving. I'm afraid we're going to get to that point. I've heard that's what's happening in Italy. So that's a real story. It's from Thursday, so presumably it's gotten worse because we see exponential growth. We're going to see doubling. I mean, this isn't exactly exponential, but basically we're seeing doubling happen every 3 to 5 days, depending on what you want to believe. And there are social separation measures that people are largely ignoring are making this worse. So we're going to have a lot more people. You know, you're talking about places where, in Louisiana, we're talking about what? This is 1,000 cases in a state that has 4.6 million people as of 2018. So you're talking about a very, very, very small number. They haven't even gotten to the starting line yet. And hopefully a lot of people don't get it too badly. We always hope for that. We don't want any bad news. But realistically, I think we have enough evidence to know that we're going to have a lot of people who are going to deal with this. And of those 4 million people, I would say that at least we should assume that probably upwards of 800, 900,000, let's call it 1 million to use a round number, are at high risk. And as he reports, a lot of these people don't have pre-existing health conditions, aren't in the high-risk groups, and still are needing ventilators. So how high does that number go? I don't know. But I know this, that they're going to have a very hard time managing that. And And that's been one of the big problems with this, that, we're going to talk in a lot of detail about what the supply shortages have meant, and we're going to get into that in 1 second. But before we do that, I'm going to jump over a little bit. I wanted to share this piece. This is from Hong Kong English News, RTHK, out of Hong Kong. So this is Wuhan denying virus tests to keep numbers down. This was published today, earlier today at looks like 1:35 Hong Kong time, so that would have been around probably around midnight Eastern. And this is just, they don't have an attributed person, but I'll put the link up, obviously. So, despite claims made by mainland authorities there have been no new local infections of the coronavirus of Wuhan in the last few days, people there are telling RTHK this is simply not the case. They say patients are being turned away from hospitals without testing to back the official data, which one person described as a, quote, not medical but political treatment, end quote. The city, which was the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak and has become a worldwide pandemic, is now returning to normal, according to officials there. Wuhan authorities have already closed the 10 or so temporary hospitals that were set up after regular ones came inundated with patients. The temporary facilities were doing tests on people showing mild symptoms. Officials say these tests are not needed as the number of new infections has fallen sharply. But a Wuhan resident, who gave his surname as Wan, disputed this claim. He said that his 70-year-old mother suffered from pneumonia once again after she was discharged from a hospital and is now in isolation at a hotel. He said no hospitals would admit her because she wasn't tested positive. And he also said there's nothing much he can do because he can't leave his home as lockdown is still in force and local health authorities only told him to wait. I feel helpless, he said. Other Wuhan residents reported similar experiences. A member of a volunteer group said his mother, who is in hospital with a heart problem, had seen coronavirus patients being turned away by staff. Zhang Yi said a political need is making mainland authorities claim there have been no new local infections. Whether the official figure is accurate or not, I think you will know. This is a political treatment, not a medical treatment. Tens of thousands of people in Wuhan have been infected by the virus since the outbreak began last year. Official figures show more than 2,500 patients in the city died from the disease. A man whose mother died from COVID-19 criticized the government for failing to warn people about the epidemic and even claiming there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission up until about January. Ding Ding said the government was responsible for his mother's death and plans to file a lawsuit for compensation. Basically, our family is the victim and we will ask for compensation. An NGO has formed a legal team to assist coronavirus patients or their families to file civil claims against the government. I don't think China's going to care, but I wanted to share this with you. Little bits and pieces are coming out here and there. And the problem China's having is they want to say that everything's fine. The minute they go back to work, man, this thing flares right up. And they cover it up, and they're allowed to do that because the WHO has been behind them every step of the way. So I wanted to let you know that. And look, judge for yourself if you think China's telling the truth. You've seen the numbers from Italy. At this point, they had more deaths earlier in the case with half as many people infected. So what doesn't add up? We're going to find out, unfortunately. So I wanted to share this one with you here. And this is a short one. I said I wasn't going to go into Italy or any of these other countries, but this is from oe24.at. That's Austrian news. That's their end suffix for their websites. And this is called Fighting Corona. It's from yesterday. Italian doctors, and mind you, this is translated from German, so it might be a little funny in some of the words, but I wanted to share with you. Italian doctors report they're at their end of their strength. Dr. Romano Paolucci fights the deadly virus at the epicenter of the corona outbreak in Italy. Speaking to the Italian media, he says that he and his colleagues are at the end of their powers. So I just want to let you know what to expect, and just a very quick glimpse into how bad it's going in Italy. We'll go much more deeply tomorrow. The Dr. Romano Paolucci was called back from his pension to support the fight against the coronavirus. He told the Italian media about his experience in one of the worst affected regions. Paolucci is one of 70 doctors who work at the small Ogliopolo hospital. A few weeks ago, all diseases such as tumors were treated here. Now the doctors in Cremona are fighting for the life of every single patient. According to Paolucci, there are so many deaths on site that medical professionals, quote, no longer count the dead. Keep that in mind. So this number, we really don't even know if it's right because that's happened. And I know that happened in China, and that was the case. That's what it looked like to those of us who were watching this in late January and early February before they really shut down the firewall there. It wasn't until Saturday that it was announced that around 800 new corona deaths were reported within 24 hours in Italy. The number of infected people continued to grow rapidly. There are currently more than 59,000 coronavirus infected people. We have reached the end of our strength. We work here in a small hospital and take in an unbelievable number of patients. We have run out of capacity. Resources of personnel are becoming scarce, and now dozens of hospital employees are getting sick, said Dr. Paolucci to the Italian media about the situation in Cremona. The staff have reached the end of both their physical and psychological powers. According to Paolucci, Ogliopo Hospital would only have 3 free beds available for emergency operations. All resources were mobilized for the fight against COVID. Dr. Daniela Ferrari, who also works in the crisis area, added that almost 20% of the employees have now been sent to home quarantines because they became infected while treating coronavirus patients. While the number of coronavirus deaths continues to rise in Italy, Lombardy is encouraged. For the first time, a falling number of new people were reported in the severely affected cities of Bergamo and Brescia on Sunday. These are the Lombard cities that have reported the highest death toll since the February 20th epidemic. The number of new infected in the 2 cities has halved compared to Saturday. If this trend continues until Tuesday, one can be confident, said the Lombard health officer Giulio Galera on Facebook. In the Lombard capital of Milan, too, the number of newly infected people has decreased. And perhaps that speaks to the lockdown happening up there early that happened 2 or 3 weeks ago. So you can start to see the benefits of this. Although, I want to be careful. We want to have a weekday number. I've noticed over the course of watching this, weekend numbers can be a little funny. I'm not saying they're lying. I'm just saying the way people report is a little different and the way it gets counted. So we'll see, but that could be some good news there. That they're flattening the trend lines. Hopefully they're succeeding at that. 84% of the 5,476 fatalities registered in Italy so far were reported in the 3 northern regions of Lombardy, Emilia-Romagna, and Piedmont. Only 1 person that dead was under the age of 50, said the president of Italy's Supreme Health Institute, Franco Lottelli. In the age group under 20, there are no people in the ICU. Despite the lower number of growth in the number of infected people, the situation in the Lombard hospitals remains dramatic. We are unable to take all the sick people to hospital today, which means that many people have to die at home, said Bergamo Mayor Giorgio Gori. The death toll in the city is higher than the official statistics toll. And that's the mitigating thing. How many people are dying at home who can't get to the hospital? How many people are not being accounted for, which even the doctors say is a problem. So one of the things that I think we have to guard against is overwhelming optimism about what numbers suggest, because as this gets crazier, our accounting will probably become less precise, which doesn't mean we don't want to find good news and go ahead and celebrate when it happens, but I think you need to know all those that information. We'll look much more into Italy, Spain, and see what's happening there as these countries move into and toward lockdown. Keep in mind, from the time lockdown starts, if there's going to be any benefit in flattening of the curve, it's probably going to take anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks to fully manifest. For a lot of different reasons, not the least of which that when you send people home at first, you're basically putting a lot of people in close quarters with one another. So if one sick person is in lockdown with 5 healthy people, you're going to get a lot of people sick that are going to come out as a later sort of manifestation. It's not just that you lock them in place and they stop getting people sick, but they stop spreading as much. So I think that's important too. Okay, so I have one quick piece here from Canada because we've seen a big jump up there, and I know we have a lot of listeners up there, so I'm just going to give you a quick update on this. And I know now they are reporting cases in each of the Canadian provinces up there, with British Columbia and Ontario being the hardest hit. So this is from Reuters, from David Lundgren, if I'm pronouncing that right, Canada, and it's from yesterday at 4:13 in the afternoon. Canada coronavirus death toll jumps. Officials could punish those ignoring precautions. Ottawa. The Canadian death toll from the coronavirus outbreak jumped more than 50% on Sunday, and impatient officials threatened to punish people refusing to take precautions to fight the spread of the highly contagious illness. The number of deaths from the respiratory disease rose to 20 by 6 p.m. on Sunday from 13 the previous day, Ottawa said, while the number of confirmed cases jumped from 1,430 to 1,430 from 1,099. There are now coronavirus cases in all 10 Canadian provinces. Canada has already closed its borders to all but essential travel and announced a $27 billion Canadian or $19 billion American aid package for people and businesses most affected by the crisis. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said more measures would be needed. We're looking now at what those next steps are to ensure our economy is able to pick up again once we're through this. It is likely to take months, he told reporters on Sunday, but did not give details. The House of Commons will return on Tuesday to approve the stimulus package. A handful of legislators will be present since only 20 parliamentarians are needed to conduct business. Ottawa says people who have returned from abroad must isolate themselves for 14 days, and Health Minister Patty Hajdu said she could use the Federal Quarantine Act to sanction those ignoring that requirement. We will use every measure to ensure compliance, she told a briefing. This could include monetary penalties up to and including criminal penalties. Nova Scotia on Sunday became the last of Canada's provinces to declare a state of emergency, closing borders to non-residents and threatening to arrest those who do not practice self-distancing. Premier Stephen McNeil told a news conference that despite warnings to avoid meeting in large groups, people were flocking to provincial parks and other common areas. We are dealing with a deadly virus and this behavior is unacceptable, he said. His Atlantic province is banning gatherings of more than 5 people, a much stricter limit than other jurisdictions. So Nova Scotia is really tightening things up there on the coast. Good for the people of Halifax. In Quebec, the second most populous province, Premier François Legault tightened existing restrictions to force the closure of all shopping malls. Only food and liquor stores and pharmacies can stay open. Right now, there's still too many people in shopping malls, he told a briefing, saying restaurants would only be able to offer takeout service. All schools will be shut until May 1st. So you're starting to see Canada up its measures, and that you see different premiers taking more action there, especially in the eastern provinces. Not as much yet in the western province, although I'm sure they're doing that in Vancouver. We'll take a look at BC in the days ahead. So I wanted to talk about Seattle. We talked about Seattle early in a lot of this, and New York's kind of jumped past it. But I'm sitting there last night, and my wife says, "Why haven't we heard much about Washington lately?" And I think it's a great question. We know that there was the cluster spreading through the nursing homes, the Evergreen Kirkland cluster. And we know that this is a state that's had a lot. It was very aggressive about its testing. It got out in front of it, and it's recognized some value to that and having a better feel for this. However, let's talk about how people are behaving on the ground, because what we know is the number of people who are out practicing social distancing or not plays a very big role in this. And the truth is, in the American response especially, other countries too, but especially in America, there are whole groups of people who just do not have any interest in following any request to shelter in place or to lock down, and who are spreading this disease all over the place. So this piece is from 770 KTTH, okay? And this is by Jason Rance. It says, I guess he's a talk radio personality, I guess. But I thought it was an interesting piece because it takes shots at everyone, and I think it's relevant. So this is by Jason Rance, and it's Selfish Seattle to Force Coronavirus Shelter-in-Place Directive. And it goes as follows. This was from 9:30 a.m. yesterday on the 22nd. I think Governor Jay Inslee will offer a coronavirus shelter-in-place directive on Monday. Selfish Seattle residents will be mostly to blame after a weekend of ignoring the governor's pleas to stay home. Inslee's Friday's press conference could not have been more clear. He was begging you to stay home as much as possible, or he would be forced to take an extreme measure. That extreme measure, a shelter-in-place directive. He has no choice. And he shows an example of this, a tweet from Governor Inslee, who was saying, I heard a few people gathered in large groups this weekend. A reminder, you are endangering yourself, your loved ones, and the vast majority of Washingtonians who are responding responsibly. It is reckless and must stop, okay? But of course it didn't. So coronavirus shelter in place is coming. There's no way around it. The number of cases continue to rise. It's not so much that the mortality rate is alarming high, although it's higher right now than the flu. It's that if we continue to strain our hospitals, more people will suffer and die, and that's not all. If there's an outbreak in the Seattle Police Department with already low staffing, an entire precinct could be crippled. If a Costco or Safeway is full of people who are sick, it could end up closing entire stores. Think the economy is hurting now? Wait until Amazon's warehouse is closed down because of the spread of the coronavirus. Inslee asked folks to stay home, and the first moment they realized it was nice outside, they took to Alki Beach like it was the last time they'll see spring. For some elderly people who will get the coronavirus from them, it literally could be. It's not so much that only Seattleites went out when they didn't need to. It's how many decided to ignore advice and treat this weekend like we didn't have a global pandemic on our hands. It's packed, and even people are saying, what about the social distancing? People are out here living their life. You can't let it stop you. Seattleite and overtly dumb guy Terrell told Q13, not realizing if he is sick with coronavirus and asymptomatic, he could literally end up killing older or immune-compromised family or friends. And not just them, by the way. I mean, this guy doesn't even know how bad it is. Q13's A.J. Janavel spoke with a number of Seattle adults at Alki Beach. He said hundreds showed up for the good weather. They're not even saying they're disobeying in order to save the economy. At least I can understand that argument. They just don't want to. Even with social distancing, there's an extent to that. We just can't fully isolate ourselves, Jasmine complained to Q13. In 2020, with access to all the information you could possibly want and the ability to communicate with pretty much everyone from our couch, we just can't fully isolate ourselves. She seems fine contributing to a pandemic because she's a selfish narcissist. But that's not all per Janavel. It wasn't just people taking social distancing lightly. Several businesses allowed customers to eat takeout food on their property. One restaurant even served people alcohol while they ordered takeout food despite statewide restrictions. It's like they need dead bodies piled in the streets before they pay attention. Hypocrites on both sides. Some progressives and conservatives have acted like abject hypocrites when it comes to the coronavirus. Progressives, particularly younger ones, purposely misstate data to claim we're a decade away from global warming irrevocably destroying this planet. We must ask now, they proclaim defiantly, but when asked to self-isolate for a week in order to save innocent lives, they head to the beach instead. They scream that Donald Trump is an imbecile who will kill us all. We should listen to the doctors, they say. The doctors who tell us to stay home, but we don't like those answers, so I guess we should ignore them. Conservatives will proclaim they're pro-life because an innocent child is worth saving. They will actively push policies to restrict women's access to abortion. But when it comes to saving older people, suddenly they're no longer pro-life. They complain that they won't have the government tell them when they can or can't leave their homes. As someone who is pro-life, my values extend to the elderly and immunocompromised. In fairness to the dopes in Seattle, they're not the only ones ignoring Italy's directives. State Representative Jim Walsh posted a video from Westport where dozens of people congregated for a scheduled razor clam dig, and he posted, "It's a beautiful day. I can't blame people for wanting to go to the beach. That's why I live here. But big crowds like this make extraordinary measures from Olympia more likely. Use good judgment. Avoid big crowds." Inslee has vacillated between a decent leader and a goofy bonehead choosing jokes over a clear message. Perhaps that's why people are ignoring him, or perhaps they're just selfish. Either way, when he calls for a coronavirus shelter-in-place directive, he will be right to do so. It needs to get done to help blunt the curve of infections that public health officials say is necessary before this gets out of control. And if that happens, it will not just take innocent lives, it will absolutely destroy the economy. A few days of pain will get this over much more quickly. All right, so I shared that with you, and look, I know everyone's offended. That's why I picked this one. Everyone should be offended from this, because the bottom line is so many people are still putting politics or personal lifestyle choices above health, and it's making this virus worse. It's absolutely true. If you're a progressive, if you're a conservative, that you need to be staying home. Whatever you are, those titles don't mean what they used to. Look, I'm a guy who theoretically would be listed as conservative or right of that, talking to an audience that I know is mostly progressive. It's not really important now. I've said there's survivors and there's griefers, and that's all there really is at this point. And I really do believe it, because these other people are just acting so poorly. And I hope, I understand that Governor Inslee is trying to give people the opportunity to do the right thing. It's a very American way of thinking. I think we can see Americans are not going to do the right thing. And we see this in Seattle, we see it in California, we see it in New York, we see it everywhere. We see it in Texas. It's not a left-right thing. It's a human people thing. It's that culturally we are habituated to thinking we are going to do what we want to do. Young people think they're not going to get sick. They're invincible. They don't care what happens to the old more than they care about what happens to themselves. And a lot of people don't care at all. And they think that this isn't going to happen to them. And these behaviors are what's going to take this disease, which could be managed but won't be. And I just use this as an example of what's happening in Seattle, because people are doing the things that ensure this is going to get much better. What happens when it does? We go to New York. This piece is from the New York Times. It's a longer piece, but I want to share it because it will give you a feel for what's happening there in detail. And New York looks like they're going to be most in having this, which isn't surprising given the international spread and the fact that like we talked about 2 weeks ago, New York having close transit, walking city, New York was always going to be a problem. There was just no doubt about that. Once this got in, it was going to get there. So this is from the Times. Coronavirus in New York City region is now the epicenter of the pandemic. New York City and its suburbs account for roughly 5% of global cases, forcing officials to take urgent steps to stem the outbreak. And this is by Jesse McKinley. Updated. Actually, he updated at 7:44 this morning, so I don't know what's in here. That literally happened while I had this sitting here. Interesting. Okay, 3 weeks after its first coronavirus infection was discovered, the New York City region reached an alarming milestone on Sunday, and now accounts for roughly 5% of the world's confirmed cases, making it an epicenter of the pandemic and increasing pressure on officials to take more drastic measures. Moving to stem the crisis on multiple fronts, Governor Andrew M. Cuomo pleaded with federal officials to nationalize the manufacturing of medical supplies and ordered New York City to crack down on people congregated in public. He suggested some streets could be closed, allowing pedestrians more space. The governor on Sunday announced measures intended to prepare for a wave of patients, including setting up free temporary hospitals in 3 New York City suburbs and erecting a massive medical bivouac in the Jacob Javits Center on Manhattan's West Side. That's their convention center in New York. Already, hospitals across the New York region are reporting a surge of coronavirus patients and a looming shortage of critical supplies like ventilators and masks. And we'll have more on that in a second. A rapid increase in testing has revealed the extent of the outbreak. Community spread of the highly contagious virus now appears commonplace. All told, more than 15,000 people in New York State have tested positive, with the vast majority in the New York City region. That is about half of the cases in the United States. And keep in mind, that's because they're testing now, finally, and I don't think it's just that they have that many people, although they do. Put it this way, I think other places have a lot more people than are being reported, and that's just starting to become understood as this starts to kick up. Worldwide, the pandemic has sickened more than 314,700 people, according to official counts. And just to put it in perspective for you, New York pushes up towards about 9 million people. I think it's about 17 million in the metro area. So if you have about 9,000 people having this, you're at a point where you have 1 in 1,000 people have this. So we are dealing with this level of crisis already with just a very, very small amount, 0.1% of the population in New York saying they have this. But keep in mind, that's going to double quickly. That'll go to 2 to 4. We'll be at 1% of the population within the next... let's see, we should be at 1.6% of the population if there isn't a major flattening of the curve within the next 12 to 15 days. And from there, that's when it gets scary. You get to 2% 3 days later, 4%. And at that point, things will have to happen. But as I reported at the beginning, we see that there's been a delay in shutting these things down. And it's good that the officials, Governor Cuomo, Mayor de Blasio, are trying to get in front of this. But I just want to give you a feel for how that number goes. Just remember, every 3 days, you don't blunt this. Maybe it goes longer if some of the blunting helps, but 3 to 7 days, you could see this double. So you're now at 1 in 1,000 people. We have talked that the crisis in the medical system we projected would happen when we got to the point where 1 in 250 people were sick, based upon the shortage of ventilators, medical supplies, hospital beds, all of that, right? So if those numbers hold true, New York would be probably, if we're saying 1 in 2, well, if we're 1 in 1,000, you double 1 in 500. New York is 7 days away from being in full crisis. Probably 7 to 9 days, depending on how conservative you are in your estimates. That's why they're rushing to get in there. This will be the last week of normalcy we have. After that, we're going to be in a bad spot, unless something happens very differently with the infection rate. But we have a lot of evidence now from Italy and actions that have been taken. That's not going to be the case, and we'll see what ends up happening here. Okay. Continuing the story, about 1 in 8 patients in New York State has been hospitalized, so the 12.5%. That's a little bit lower, but we'll see how that goes. 114 people had died by Sunday morning, state officials have said, though the toll in New York City rose rapidly during the course of the day. Mr. Cuomo said most of the disease were over the age of 70, a cohort considered particularly susceptible to the disease's respiratory attacks. Keep in mind what we learned in Italy. I think this is important here, and it gets lost. The old people get sick faster from it. The cases that came in the second wave in Lombardy came about a week behind them, where younger people who presumably had more immune response but failed to fight off the virus then started coming into the hospitals. We'll have to see if that pattern holds true in New York and other places throughout the U.S. and the world. Okay, so let's see. New York City had an eerie feel all weekend long, bright and sunny, with commercial streets largely deserted now that restaurants and most stores have been closed to curb the coronavirus. The governor's newest actions came as New York adopted its toughest measures to stem the spread of the virus. As of 8 p.m. on Sunday, all non-essential businesses were ordered closed, and edicted darkened storefronts from Brooklyn to Buffalo. Residents were told to stay inside except for necessities like food, medicine, and short bouts of exercise. Mr. Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio have repeatedly emphasized New York City would not be locked down, saying that all transportation links, including subways and commuter railways, would continue to function at times on limited schedules. There's not going to be chaos, there's not going to be anarchy, Mr. Cuomo said, but he also warned of months of restrictions. The timeline, no one can tell you. It depends on how we handle it, Mr. Cuomo said. But 40%, up to 80% of the population will end up getting this virus. All we're trying to do is slow the spread, but it will spread. While groceries, car repair, and takeout food were exempted, the state and city's normally vibrant social and commercial life is being put on pause, as Mr. Cuomo put it, resulting in enormous numbers of layoffs and frantic shoppers stockpiling food and other supplies in advance of the 8 p.m. deadline. We're going to have some numbers on just how bad the economics are going to be near the end of this. It's frightening. In New York, where hundreds of new cases were being reported in every borough, Mayor de Blasio was equally blunt about the days ahead. We are now in New York City, the epicenter of the crisis in the United States of America, Mr. de Blasio said. I am not happy to tell you that. You are not happy to hear it. Earlier in the day, Mr. de Blasio warned you, the worst is yet to come. April is going to be a lot worse than March, and I fear May could be worse than April. And that's probably true. That's a realistic assessment. Especially if you flatten this curve. If you flatten the curve at all, what happens is you end up with bad months for a while. It's just like, it's going to be really hard to get around that. It's not anyone's fault at this point. It's just, it's the nature of how these things spread. Late Sunday, the city released stark new figures that showed 1,800 people hospitalized, including 450 in intensive care units. All told, the city reported 10,764 positive cases of coronavirus, with more than 3,000 cases each in Brooklyn and Queens. There are now 99 fatalities. So you're looking at that's 100 out of 10,000. That's 1 in 100, but we're very early in this, so that number is probably going to go up because cases are not resolved. If you ever want to know what's happening, you have to kind of compare the number of cases that resolved versus the number of cases that have not. Worldwide, in terms of this outbreak, we've had 2 cases resolved for every 1 that has died, and we have about 85% of these cases unresolved. And that's going to be really hard to determine for a while. We're not going to know for a month how bad this is really going to be. Then we should start getting a better feel. The mayor, who has been harshly critical of the federal response, said he spoke to Mr. Trump and Vice President Pence late Sunday and said the two men seemed to sense the urgency of the situation. I want to see help arrive rapidly, Mr. de Blasio said, who said the city's public hospitals were 10 days from running out of really basic supplies, which fits that sort of assessment we made coming into this. Indeed, hospitals in the New York City region were confronting a wave of patients even as they prepared for more dire circumstances. The governor told hospitals to double capacity in expectation of a rising tide of sick people. The influx was already apparent at places like New York Presbyterian, where officials said they had seen more than 500 coronavirus patients by Sunday morning. The hospital instituted a variety of rules to control spread of the virus, including banning partners from pregnant women delivery rooms. The state was also repurposing existing healthcare facilities to including nursing homes, to act as temporary hospitals, even as the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that's FEMA, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers made plans to turn the Javits Center into a temporary medical center. All told, upward of 2,000 beds will be prepped inside the convention center, some manned by federal emergency personnel. The governor was still asking for more help with staffing and supplies, stating that the states were vying for the same emergency products, causing prices for basic items like protective masks to soar. This state cannot manage it. States all across the country can't manage it, said Mr. Cuomo, third-term Democrat, adding, I'm competing with California and Illinois and Florida. That's not the way it should be. And you know what's going to happen, I'll just tell you, is things are going to be kept local as much as they can, or at least enough will be sifted off so people can protect themselves where the factories are. And that's natural, but it's a problem. It's a big problem. It's a problem internationally as well as intranationally. He also asked President Trump to utilize the Defense Production Act, a Cold War-era law which allows factories to be repurposed, mixing praise for the president with more direct appeals for assistance from federal authorities. New York was not alone in tightening the rules surrounding businesses and its citizens' daily lives. Similar structures are in California and Illinois, as well as neighboring New Jersey, which reported nearly 2,000 cases as well, including 20 deaths. There were also signs that emergency personnel were beginning to bear the brunt of the disease. New York City Police said Sunday the department now has 98 confirmed cases, including 28 civilian employees. There were also numerous reports of infections among inmates and guards at jails. Mr. Cuomo went out of his way to criticize the behavior of some New York City residents. It's insensitive, it's arrogant, it's self-destructive, it's disrespectful to other people, and it has to stop, Mr. Cuomo says. It has to stop now. To that end, he ordered city officials to immediately come up with a plan to shut down such behavior, including ideas like closing streets to traffic. Mr. Cuomo stopped short of calling for closing parks, noting that the city's larger public green spaces, such as Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, Central Park in Manhattan, and Prospect Park in Brooklyn, were big enough to allow people to be outside without close contact with others. The Speaker of the New York City Council, Corey Johnson, said playgrounds as well as volleyball and basketball courts should be closed. Mr. de Blasio said that playgrounds will remain open for now, but warned they aren't regularly disinfected. I mean, why would you do that? That's just so stupid. Kids are going to go around, bring it to their home, and these things, I don't know why they're being done this way. Parents must take full responsibility for keeping their child healthy and away from other children, the mayor said. I'm sure kids playing basketball will think that way, right? Thousands of tests continued to be conducted, even as some city leaders suggested the disease had become so endemic that resources might be better used on treating patients rather than identifying them. That's something you're going to see and hear a lot more about, because realistically, we missed that window. Not that there isn't value to it, but if they put all their effort into testing at the cost of doing other things, which unfortunately our government doesn't seem particularly good at any level at doing two things at once, that would be the wrong decision. The right decision would be to do both. The practical decision would be to do what you need right now. And hopefully we get someone who has the vision to do it, because we haven't had that. Anyway, Councilman Mark D. Levine, a Manhattan Democrat who chairs the Health Committee, said on Twitter Sunday the number of positive cases was unimportant. Only one thing matters now: treatment of the gravely ill. At the same time, the state said it was actively seeking ways to combat the virus by buying large batches of three drugs, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and chloroquine, aiming to begin drug trials this week. And just to put a little something on that, there's a study out there. I'll find it for you. We'll put it out there. But it talks about how in, I think it was in Italy, they were using hydroxychloroquine with azithromycin, and they were having a lot of positive benefits in getting mild cases to cure. A lot of these treatments have really been effective at reducing the viral load early in this, which is why having quick intervention is important. We don't know how it would work for the more severe cases, and once it gets to that deep lung invasive level, there's been problems with that. I want to say it's very careful. These are not necessarily cures. They're just helpful. But they're helpful. So President Trump has promoted the drugs as potentially helpful in curbing the pandemic, but medical experts have cautioned their effectiveness has not yet been shown in clinical trials, as he has repeatedly done since the coronavirus has overtaken his state. Mr. Cuomo sought on Sunday to balance calls for action with reassurances about people's resilience in hard times. We overcome challenges, and this is a period of challenge for this generation, he said. So that is what's happening in New York City. And New York City is going to blow up this week. I don't know how else to put it. It's going to be bad, and it's going to get worse. But perhaps they're in front of it a little bit, and that would be good. But here's the problem on the inside. So this next piece, there was a memo, and I had actually seen it because it was on a doctor's group that someone was kind enough to share with me. But I'm glad it's out in the public now so we can talk about it. This is an internal memo from the chief surgeon at New York Presbyterian Hospitals. And I'm reading a story about it rather than reading the whole memo, just so you get a feel for it. This is from ABC News, and it came out 10:37 yesterday, and by John Santucci and Matthew Mosk. Internal memos by the chief surgeon at New York Presbyterian Hospital revealed new details about the coming threat. Supplies of masks, equipment, available beds is well short of impending needs. So, here's what it says. Internal memos by the chief surgeon at New York Presbyterian Hospital were intended to rally the giant medical center's doctors and nurses as they prepared to confront a surge of patients with COVID-19, but they also revealed new estimates about the coming threat that had not previously been public. Medical experts in New York do not expect the number of cases to peak for another 22 to 32 days, the memo written by Dr. Craig Smith says, and the supplies of masks, equipment, and available beds is well short of the impending need. He estimated the crush of patients will require from 700 to 934 intensive care beds. The lower estimate exceeds our ICU capacity, even with surge construction, said Smith, a cardiac surgery pioneer who has headed the hospital's surgery department since 2010. Like many hospitals around the country, Smith notes they are also struggling with a limited number of personal protective equipment, or PPE. The hospital normally uses 4,000 non-N95 masks a day. Currently, they are consuming 40,000 per day, and it's estimated to reach 70,000 per day, according to Smith. The Dyer account, which he wrote on March 20th, was posted to the Twitter account at Columbia Surgery, which is part of the Presbyterian Hospital network. It was one in a growing number of posts detailing the efforts being made by doctors at one of the Big Apple's largest hospital networks. The startling figures from Smith come just hours after New York Governor Andrew Cuomo announced more restrictions on state residences and businesses in order to slow the spread of the virus. These provisions will be enforced, Cuomo said at a Friday press conference. There will be a civil fine and mandatory closure for any business that is not in compliance, because your actions can affect my health. Former Homeland Security Advisor Tom Bossert told ABC News this week on Sunday morning the coming days will require more Americans to take these threats seriously. Bossert, now an ABC News contributor, said he is concerned for the 3 states that have the largest number of positive cases right now, including New York. I say this, and I hope I'm wrong, that this is going to overwhelm the New York health system in the coming days. The letters from Smith appear to be intended to rally doctors to confront the immense challenge they're about to face. Nothing would give me greater pleasure than to apologize profusely in a few weeks for having overestimated the threat. The next month or two is a horror to imagine if we're underestimating the threat, he writes. Remember that our family, friends, and neighbors are scared, idle, out of work, and feel impotent. Anyone working in healthcare still enjoys the rapture of action. In another memo circulated Saturday, Smith referenced the famed UCLA basketball coach John Wooden when trying to motivate his team. To think we could mimic Italy seemed risible a week ago. Not today, Smith writes. No one is standing still, wringing their hands. The chairman ends his weekend memo with an optimistic message quoting Wooden. Failing to plan is planning to fail. That will not be us. Smith told ABC News the memos are circulating much more widely than we imagined and creating angst in other quarters over control of the message. I'm thinking about today how to deal with that. Yeah, they're thinking they don't want you to hear these things, as usual. That's why you don't hear about this story. You should be. Which is why we share with you. By the way, Coronavirus Central, we always give you the straight news. I give you the information on the ground. You assess it how you want. I give you the best analysis that can be offered, but you get to hear what's happening on the ground. Everyone else tells you the CDC said this. You can visit the CDC website in 5 seconds, but if you want to hear what's happening on the ground, we work desperately to get that data to you, because that's how we make our assessments, based on what's happening, not what they think are going to happen when we can do so. In one of the letters, Smith, who supervises more than 100 full-time faculty members, references the story of the sled dog named Balto, who helped save infected children by carrying life-saving serum to Nome to fight the 1925 diphtheria epidemic, an inspiring story that became an animated feature film, Balto. A bronze statue of the hero dog has been located in New York City's Central Park since December 1925. So what can we do? Load the sled, check the traces, feed Balto, and mush on. Our cargo must reach Nome. So that's what we're looking at, and I think it's interesting that he said that he was expecting from the 20th that the peak would happen in about 32 days, which would be late April. So let's just do some real quick math. Let's assume that this is doubling twice per week. If we're at, we use 10,000 cases just to make the math easy. Okay, so if it's doubling, so a week from now, that's 40,000. A week after that's 160,000. A week after that, 640,000. And 4 weeks from now, you're looking at 2.56 million people being infected in New York. That would make sense as a peak if you had the current rate of progression, because at that point, you're talking about a third of the people of New York getting infected. And once you've reached that point, what will end up happening beyond that is that the peak will inevitably begin to fall. If it blows through that hot, which will mean a lot of sick people and a lot of dead people, to be honest, but if it blows that hot, and it may blow close to that hot, that's like a sort of a worst case scenario in a lot of ways. You would be dealing with an optimized caseload, the way bell curves work, of maybe 3 million people having it at once. It will hold, and then that peak will fall off quick, going down in a long sort of sloping return, because ultimately everyone will have had it, assuming that people can't get reinfected. So now, obviously, they wouldn't want this happening in theory, because you don't want to be dealing with 2 million people being sick at once in the middle to late part of April. Presumably social distancing would spread that out, because if you do, then you could have upwards of, well, let's use their number. We'll use their number of 12.5%, 1 in 8 people we read from their thing. So let's just say at some point you have 2 million people needing this, and you're doing it times 12.5. Excuse me, so times 0.25. You're dealing with potentially 250,000 people who would need critical care, and there's nowhere on earth that can provide that. That's more than the capacity of the United States of America. There's 160,000 critical beds if you clear everyone out. And we're not even talking, one thing that in the back of this, we talk about deaths and coronavirus, we're not talking about is people who can't go to hospitals now. I've heard multiple stories, I'm sure you have too, of people who are not being admitted for other things because this epidemic is out there and you can't bring sick people in. You can't use those hospital resources. There's going to be a lot of people who die from otherwise protectable things, and then we're asking these people to survive this. And if you have this many people all sick at once, 3 weeks from now, I don't know. That's why social distancing has to happen, why the government's going to have more austere shelter-in-place orders, and they're taking too long. And, you read this story, people are still going out shopping. I read the story from Seattle. People are sending their kids to playgrounds. This is absolutely insane that we're doing this, and yet we are. I mean, we better hope that these cures work better and there's more supplies than there seems to be, or that, maybe this doesn't end up being as bad as we fear, that we have to prepare for, in spite of all evidence, because absent that, this is going to be a calamity. If the numbers hold, and I'm just giving you the evidence, but you do the math yourself, we'll look at this. And here's some more evidence to suggest that the problem is going to get worse, not better. I hate to share stuff like this with you, but when we started doing this show, you can go back to the very early episodes, coronaviruscentral.net. I released all the early ones where I didn't know yet how to do this, and we were talking for about a half hour about something we saw in the distance and thought might be a big deal. One of the things we were concerned about is China shutting down was going to shut down medical supplies, and we wondered back then if what would happen was we would need things at a time when they would not be able to get them to us, and that the worst part of it would come with the virus getting people sick 2-3 months distant, where that's when the supply chain hurt would really begin to be felt. This piece from the AP, Martha Mendoza and Juliet Linderman, really goes into that. It's a great piece, a lot of details, but details that are important for us to understand what our expectations are. Imports of medical supplies plummet as demand in the U.S. soars. And as you'll recall, we talked about 4 key restricting measures, and I'm going to increase that to 5 just to make it a little easier, because 1 and 2 are very much related. 1 is the number of staff, and 2 is the number of personal protection equipment. Originally, I just treated that as PPE, but it's a little more complex than that, so let's pull them out. Number 3 is your medicine, right? If that's chloroquine, Governor Cuomo, Mayor de Blasio are saying that they're buying it up, but they're fighting with different states for it. As well as with the PPE. The ventilators is going to be a big point, obviously, trying to get those out there. There are some really interesting solutions where they're getting those numbers up, but getting them produced in time is going to be a challenge, as well as getting the funding, given that Washington continues to dither recklessly, even as senators are getting sick now, which is interesting, with Senator Paul being confirmed diagnosis from Kentucky. And then the 5th piece, of course, is going to be the number of beds themselves. And you see the Army Corps of Engineers basically retrofitting the New York Convention Center, as well as moving hospital ships into place to try to help with that. The big cities are getting help first because they're getting hit. But as your city gets hit behind it, those resources won't be there for you. So whatever you have on hand, everyone's fighting for federal support. Realistically, you have what you have where you're at, because the federal government can't be everywhere. And I'm going to tell you right now, they're going to be right now they are showing their hand. They're going to be in New York and Los Angeles. Those are the places that could count on federal help. And I have a hunch Washington will get it too, for reasons that are easy enough to figure out. Beyond that, it's going to be harder. So be aware of that. Okay, so let's go into this thing. The critical shortage of medical supplies across the U.S., including testing swabs, Protective masks, surgical gowns, and hand sanitizer can be tied to a sudden drop in imports, mostly from China, the AP has found. Trade data shows the decline in shipments started mid-February after the spiraling coronavirus outbreak in China led the country to shutter factories and disrupted ports. Some emergency rooms, hospitals, and clinics in the U.S. have now run out of key medical supplies, while others are rationing personal protective equipment like gloves and masks. The United States counts on receiving the vast majority of its medical supplies from China, where the coronavirus has, I'm going to insert supposedly, infected more than 80,000 people and killed more than 3,200. Actually, I should do at least. That's better. When Chinese medical supply factories began coming back online last month, their first priority was their own hospitals. The government required makers of N95 masks to sell all or part of their production internally instead of shipping masks to the U.S. The most recent delivery of medical-grade N95 masks arrived from China about a month ago, on February 19th, and as few as 13 shipments of non-medical N95 masks have arrived in the past month. Half as many as arrived the same month last year. N95 masks are used in industrial settings as well as hospitals and filter out 95% of airborne particles, including ones too tiny to be blocked by regular masks. Governors across the country are becoming panicked as states run out of equipment. President Donald Trump has urged them to buy masks on the open market, but few, if any, are available. I mean, one of the things that isn't told in this, I'm not really criticizing, but it's just true, is there were a ton of people, we were watching this in late January, early February, who bought up a huge amount of the domestic U.S. mask supply and sent it right over to China. I mean, there was a big market for it then, and, if the government had been more forward-thinking, one wonders. Without adequate protection, more of our hospital staff could become ill, which would mean there wouldn't be people to care for patients, said Nancy Foster, the American Hospital Association's Vice President of Quality and Patient Safety Policy. Some hospitals are down to just a day or two of personal protective equipment. AP found in the past month hand sanitizer and swab imports dropped by 40%. Remember, swabs are how they were testing. N95 mask imports were down 55%, and surgical gowns typically sourced from China were near normal levels because the sourcing has shifted to Honduras. Typically, medical supplies are delivered along both coasts, but almost all the supplies that did arrive in the past month came into Newark, New Jersey, across the country from the earliest and most severe coronavirus outbreaks. So you could probably expect from that there's going to be shortages more on the West Coast than the East Coast. And we actually were hearing that. That's true, even though the East Coast is eating up their supply quickly. The AP identified the following imports by looking at the shipment data maintained by Import Genius and Panjiva Inc., services that independently track global trade. In mid-February, the World Health Organization warned that global demand for safety gear and medical providers was 100 times higher than normal. Prices were 20 times higher, stockpiles were depleted, and there was a 4 to 6 month backlog. Despite this, federal contracting data shows there was no big effort at that point to submit orders. So, what does that prove to you? That unless they're building it domestically, independently, that the federal government was blindsided. And that's just inexcusable because a lot of people saw this, myself included, and a number of you who've been listening. Trade policies haven't helped. Tariffs on medical supplies made them more expensive, and they were only lifted March 5th, even though healthcare associations asked the administration last year to exempt items like masks, gloves, and gowns. And now countries including South Korea, India, and Taiwan are blocking exports of medical supplies to save them for their own citizens, leaving the U.S. with fewer options. The lag time could be weeks. It could be upwards of months, said Kadare Kaleja, CEO of the Healthcare Supply Chain Association. Doctors, nurses, and first responders in the U.S. are resorting to spraying their hands with bleach at the end of each day and hanging them up at home to dry for another day, according to the American College of Emergency Physicians. There is a little bit of anxiety, as you can imagine, going to work and not knowing if you have enough protective equipment, said Dr. David Tan, president of the National Association of EMS Physicians. The decline in swabs, which included multiple varieties, not just the ones needed to test for COVID-19. The CDC has for weeks warned that state and local health departments about the shortages of swabs, which are needed for the testing that is critical to containing the pandemic. Even over-the-counter medical shipments are decreasing. 10 shipping containers filled with medical thermometers arrived at the U.S. ports a year ago this month, but in the last 30 days, there were just 5. Hand sanitizer, also commonly sourced from China, has disappeared from U.S. stores, and it may stay scarce. Last year, by this time, 223 shipments had arrived. This year, since January, just 157 have come. The shortages affect patients because they can't get tested and their providers may be carrying the virus from one person to the next. But the far greater risk is to medical personnel. Already there are reports of dozens of doctors, nurses, and medical staff who have contracted the virus. Nurses across the country report they are not receiving proper medical or protective equipment, and their hospitals don't have the isolation rooms they need to safely care for COVID-19 patients, according to National Nurses United, the largest union of registered nurses in the U.S. It's not safe at all. Nobody's safe, said Consuelo Vargas, an emergency room nurse at Cook County Hospital in Chicago. On Friday morning, after possible exposure at work, she went to a local hardware store and bought all the painter booties and jumpsuits they had to wear while caring for people. It's so frustrating because we feel like healthcare workers are being asked for a lot, and that's fine. We can do our job. We're just asking for the equipment we need, she said. The shortage doesn't only affect healthcare. The humanitarian medical firm Direct Relief thought it was heading into 2020 well-stocked with several million N95 masks. The organization had increased its orders in 2019 after massive wildfires in the West filled cities with smoke, squeezing its supplies in recent years. But then bushfires overwhelmed Australia with smoky skies, and so Direct Relief effort began sending the masks there, Vice President Tony Moran said. When the coronavirus hit China, the organization began shipping the masks to Wuhan, the outbreak's epicenter, in an effort to contain the disease. Moran said they ordered 2 million more masks and are awaiting the shipments. Those typically take 5 weeks to arrive, 2 weeks to make the mask, 2 weeks to shipping, and a week to get through port. And keep in mind, we've been seeing the ports on the West Coast have been more or less empty. Meanwhile, he said, Direct Relief has received well over 100 requests from hospitals and health centers that are down to their last boxes. In an effort to fill the gap, Minnesota-based 3M is running its Aberdeen, South Dakota plant around the clock, producing millions of N95 masks per month. The company is also ramping up production of surgical masks and commercial cleaning solutions, CEO Mike Roman said. Nonetheless, one federal contract with 3M for $4.8 million worth of N95 masks dated March 12 says the masks will be delivered April 30th, 7 weeks later, according to public contract data. Keep in mind what the doctor, I believe it was Dr. Smith, in New York was saying that they're expecting their peak 22 to 30 days from now. This is why reaction doesn't work. So the government is going to get a fraction of the masks it needs that it's spent for a month and a half too late, 3 weeks after this peaks, potentially, if it's unblocked. This is what we deal with over and over again. That's why you have to anticipate the problems in front of you. But yeah, this article is just brilliant because it's letting you see into the nitty-gritty, because I was looking for it, and I give them credit. This is hard research that shows you that the support that they say is coming, well, it might be coming, but there's no good arriving to a battlefield after your army's already surrendered. You know what I mean? A number of Chinese companies told the AP this week they will be resuming exports, which bring higher prices, but that they are overwhelmed and can't meet demand. Chinese mask manufacturers have received too many orders from abroad, but have no time to produce all of them and make a delivery, said David Peng, manager of Ningbo by Best International Trading Company Limited. And I should say, one thing that's really relevant here is China has changed the rules in their country where if they are exporting medical goods, the goods basically go to China, and China's going to send it to the countries they're friendly with. If you think that they're not going to go ahead and use that as a lever, then you don't understand the first thing about politics. So I wouldn't count on the United States getting, very much of these. You're going to get a lot of excuses. They'll say they're not banned, but they'll pop up in every other country. Will get their orders served first, because that's what happens when you have great power conflict and asymmetrical warfare. And I know that's a very sad, stark thing to report, especially considering the number of Americans who sent help to Wuhan, as did a bunch of people around the world. But that's going to be a big part of this story. And later this week, we're going to take a much deeper look at the China-U.S. Jockeying, because I think it's really at the heart of this, how it's going to go out there. And it's a threat you need to be aware of, for reasons I'll begin laying out near the end of this show. We got a lot today, and I'm just trying to get through it, but this is too important to skip. Okay, trade data shows importers have managed to maintain some supplies by shifting factories outside of China. Shipments of surgical gowns, for example, have dropped less than 5% since December, since they are now coming from Honduras. The same is true for medical gloves, which are now primarily coming from South Korea. The federal government said a national stockpile was being made available at the state level, but governors said they weren't getting what they needed. I think every governor in the United States has been banging at the door of the federal government with respect to the stockpile. We certainly have, and we're going to continue to do so, said Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker at a news conference this week. Dr. Peter Chin Hong, an infectious disease specialist at the University of California, San Francisco, said he was alarmed by new CDC advice for hospitals that run out of masks. For the CDC to say people can wear bandanas is actually quite frightening. I never thought the CDC would say something like that. We're in the U.S. in 2020, and we have a recommendation to use bandanas. Well, Clorox is going to do well, but that's what it is. So PPE is proving to be the really nasty part. Trying to get more information on the shortage of medical drugs as well. Always looking for more information on that. We know there are big purchases happening. And this piece might help give you an idea of what's going to happen. This is from March 20th, 5:05 p.m. Through the Modern Healthcare at modernhealthcare.com, which is a blog that covers a lot of things about in the industry. Chloroquine in short supply as hospitals buy in bulk. We reported as early as mid-February that chloroquine was part of the treatment protocol that was being used with some efficacy in China as well as in North Korea. President Trump went out there and started talking about it. Everyone went to buy it. Of course, our listeners knew a couple weeks early. We try to do that as well. But they have banned purchasing that for individuals for the time being, and you can't get it. Here's why. Providers have been purchasing significant amounts of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine in anticipation. They will be used to treat COVID-19, drastically depleting available supply, according to a new report from Premier. While the U.S. FDA is still investigating whether the inexpensive old anti-malaria drugs contain symptoms and limit the spread of the highly contagious virus, hospitals have responded to clinical trials in other countries that have shown promising results. Orders of chloroquine spiked 3,000% in March, according to data from Premier, the group purchasing and consulting organization. From January 2019 through February 2020, hospitals ordered an average of 149 units per month. More than 2,300 units were ordered through March thus far. Its variant, hydroxychloroquine, experienced a 260% surge in demand, Premier data shows. Hospitals typically use about 8,800 units in a month, jumping to 16,110 in March. Chloroquine phosphate tablets and hydroxychloroquine sulfate tablets went into shortage on March 9th and March 19th, respectively, according to the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. All major wholesale distributors put hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine on allocation this week, which limits ordering to prevent hoarding, Premier says. As additional reports come forward from countries suggesting treatment protocols for COVID-19, a single source of truth in the U.S. is needed to mitigate panic buying. Premier said in the report the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, should study the international data and make recommendations for treatment protocols domestically. Chloroquine, which is also used to treat lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, isn't typically well stocked by hospitals, if at all, said Aaron Fox, a drug shortage expert and senior director of drug information and support services at the University of Utah Health. It's more of a travel medicine to be used for malaria treatment, said Fox, adding that the University of Utah Health bought a small amount at the end of February to have on hand just in case when it saw some preliminary data from China. We don't have a lot of malaria in the U.S. Probably it was fine for just one company to supply the entire U.S. While a single manufacturer produces chloroquine, 4 additional manufacturers are approved by the FDA to make it, Premier noted. There are 10 suppliers with the FDA approval to produce hydroxychloroquine, but not all of them are currently manufacturing. I suspect that's going to change. Some of the manufacturers of chloroquine and related products have lowered prices and donated millions of doses to the U.S. government. Last month, the National Institute of Health began a randomized controlled treatment for COVID-19 with Gilead Sciences' antiviral drug remdesivir is one of several drugs being tested for COVID-19 treatment, but quality and pricing conditions remain. We understand and recognize the urgency with which we are all seeking prevention and treatment options for COVID-19. FDA staff are working expeditiously on that front, FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn said in prepared remarks. We must also ensure these products are effective, otherwise we risk treating patients with a product that might not work when they could have pursued other more effective treatments. The drug supply chain is already working around restricted access to pharmaceutical ingredients. The Indian government is limiting the export of 26 ingredients, some of which are used in widely used antibiotics, to protect its domestic supply amid the pandemic. Much of the world's supply of generic drugs comes from India, which relies heavily on China for their active pharmaceutical ingredients. So I don't know how bad it's going to be when they start doing it. the global supply has been bought up. Let's put it that way. And there's a little bit more coming online. I don't know how fast it's going to get there. I don't know how fast it'll be distributed. I know that, like we were predicting, how well you did. Say you were in Utah, say you're in Salt Lake, University of Utah, okay? Maybe they will benefit because people are looking at the studies early. Maybe you listen to this podcast, you will benefit, and that's out there. We don't know, and realistically, how well these goods are going to move around, that's going to be really difficult. We know it's bad. Here's a piece from Trained Chicago Business. I want to share with you just a short piece by Stephanie Goldberg, A.D. Quigg, just adding a detail of how bad this has gotten. This is from the 19th, 5:50 p.m. Hospitals ask vets, dentists for supplies. Without more face masks and respirators that protect clinicians and support staff, sources say a worker shortage is imminent. And this is a pretty short piece, so I'll just read it. As coronavirus cases mount in Illinois, healthcare providers face a shortage of personal protective equipment. To keep workers healthy and on the job, the hospital industry is asking dentists, veterinarians, and others to donate their face masks and respirators. Healthcare providers who get exposed to COVID-19 are required to self-quarantine for 14 days to prevent further spread of the virus, even if they're not showing symptoms. Rush Oak Park Hospital said that 2 emergency room doctors have tested positive for coronavirus, the Sun-Times reports. That's going to be out of Chicago. Without medical supplies to protect clinicians and support staff, sources say a worker shortage is imminent. We anticipate the number of cases will increase dramatically in the coming days and weeks, exhausting all the PPE at hospitals. Illinois Health and Hospital Association CEO A.J. Wilhelmi said today in a Leaders to Associations for the Construction Industry, dentists, veterinarians, amongst other groups. He urged those groups to consider donating their inventory of N95 respirators, including those that may be expired, as well as foregoing other or additional orders at this time. Other supplies needed by the state's more than 200 hospitals include masks, gowns, gloves, and eye shields, he added. During a conference call with Chicago labor leaders today, Marty Smith, a registered nurse and Midwest director of National Nurses United, said she's concerned about a shortage of PPE. While some hospitals have N95 respirators, others have very few, Smith said, noting all the facilities are experiencing a very, very limited supply chain. That means they're running out, and they have a week, maybe 2 weeks of supply. She added that rationing such equipment might be putting nurses at risk. If our nurses get sick, it won't matter how many hospital beds we have in the city, they won't be able to take care of them. Meanwhile, the CDC and new guidelines for optimizing a limited supply of face masks have been criticized by some healthcare providers. In addition to suggesting workers use expired face masks or wear the same mask to treat multiple patients, the CDC recommends using a bandana or scarf as a last resort in the settings where supplies are not available. The guidelines note that caution should be exercised when considering this last option. Yeah, we're now at the throw things at the wall and see what sticks stage. And it's a bad spot. It's a rough spot, and it was one where foresight was needed, and now we're reacting. I feel bad for the nurses and the doctors who are going to get sick with this, because they are going to get sick when the spike starts, and they are going to be in quarantine when the spike hits. And you can see it as clear as day. And we'll just have to see how bad that is. I think a lot of people, seeing how bad it will get, will choose to stay at home. That's what was forced in Wuhan, what may happen here as a matter of exigent need. And even we're starting to see it here already in the United States. The thing about chloroquine as a treatment is you have to get to people while they're early. And what I've heard most hospitals are doing is saying, unless you're on the verge of dying, don't come in here. And it's a reasonable enough supposition for people because they don't want to get hospital workers sick. They don't want people who don't have coronavirus to get the COVID infection. However, you're taking those cases that you could have shifted from the mild but treatable problem into the severe but ventilated problem. And this is the problem of a lack of vision, a lack of policy planning. And if there are people, whatever country comes out of this, to look at what was done so badly in this, there's going to be a lot of anger and a lot of questions asking why, with all the stuff that was happening in China in January, why more wasn't done. And it won't be fair to just blame the politicians because people didn't want to be bothered. We have a tendency to not want to see problems that are big and terrifying like this, and we overlook it. And I've said from the beginning of this is a war for the survival of humanity in some ways, because this virus, one of the things that isn't talked about enough that's a real fear that some virologists are hinting at, but it's true, is the more people who get infected, the more risk of mutation, the more risk of another strain, and the more likelihood this is endemic. Maybe this doesn't go away. Maybe we deal with this year after year in divergent strains. Do I know that's the case? No. but it would be consistent with a number of other diseases, what they do, and it's something that really will force us to reconsider how we do everything. And that's why I said, that if we wanted to save the old world, we had to act quickly to save it, but the truth is it didn't want to save itself. That article from Seattle reports on it, or I could give you things from every spring break out there, kids having a good time, people going out there, even these orders that they have, what has essential businesses, right? So let's talk about that a little bit here. A lot of people have been seeing orders with a lot of chatter about the National Guard going around, going to shut this down, going to shut that down, okay? And we don't have a lot of evidence that has been argued directly from the people. We know that the governor of Ohio claimed they were deploying the National Guard today to help with food delivery to seniors they've asked to shelter in place, an entirely appropriate version of actions. However, there have been all these letters coming out all around the country talking about essential businesses as recognized by Homeland Security. And a lot of people have wondered how imminent a quarantine is, because with these stay-at-home orders that you are seeing in different states, these essential business operations. So I want to go ahead and go through. This article is from the National Law Review. This is from March 23rd. I'm just going to read the brief of it because it would take too long to do it. But this is from Illinois, and it's an example of what you should expect. Illinois is a little ahead of the curve. And since we're talking about Chicago today, for whatever reason, beyond the cases that are there, what they're doing in preparation. So, Illinois issues COVID-19 stay-at-home order excluding essential businesses in operation. To help slow the spread of the COVID-19 coronavirus, Governor Pritzker issued a stay-at-home order for the state of Illinois this afternoon following similar orders issued by Pennsylvania, California, and New York. The stay-at-home order will begin at 5 p.m. on Saturday, March 21st, and last through 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, April 7th, 2020, about 17 days. The governor's executive order requires individuals not employed at a, quote, essential business or operation to work remotely from home and limit travel to only the essential businesses and activities listed in the order. Thus, the order allows citizens to continue conducting normal daily activities like going to the grocery store, pharmacy, doctor's office, hospitals, but only allows employees to travel to work if they work for an essential business or operation. The order will also prohibit local governments from enforcing any home evictions, and Illinois schools will remain closed until April 8th. The list of essential businesses and other operations that are exempted from Illinois' stay-at-home order can be viewed in the attached executive order, which incorporates the definition of essential businesses from the Memorandum of Identification of Essential Critical Infrastructure Workers issued by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security on March 19th, 2020. So those letters you see come out of this memorandum. We're going to read that in a second, but the link's in here. And it's a download, so you'll have to get to it from the article. I can't just post the link directly. The state also published stay-at-home FAQs to help citizens understand how the orders may affect their activity. In terms of enforcement, the governor stated it will likely follow these steps. A, a warning. B, a cease and desist order. C, licensure revocation. D, the business could be charged with a misdemeanor. And businesses and other operations should carefully analyze whether they fall within one of the specified exemptions and may consider providing employees with a letter explaining why they're permitted to travel. And this has gone really wide about what they've considered. Like, I'll give you an example. Elon Musk literally had space vehicle manufacturer and electric car manufacturers listed as an exempted group in California. So I want to include this to you because I think what is happening, unfortunately, is that this sort of stay-at-home thing, right, that's happening, which is necessary, is being undercut by the actions that are being taken at a lot of different levels about what is actually being defined as, an essential business. So I want to just say here, so it's an 11-page document, so that includes essential and critical workers, and they have, I'm going to just read the categories here that are in this, and I'm going to put it up there so you can see it, but the categories are healthcare and public health, law enforcement, public safety, food and agriculture, energy, so they have electricity, petroleum, natural gas, propane, water and wastewater, transportation and logistics, public works, and communications and information technology. So those are the areas that are broadly out there. There's a lot of detail about what is and is not included in this. I think that's important. But what you see is that other places are basically stretching what that means. And if you go to a position where you identify critical infrastructure as 30% of the working population, which is, part of the economy, you're going to continue to have this burn through. And obviously, it's not something we can stop at this point. I think it's endemic and we're going to have to deal with it. But you need to be really aware of the choices that are being made. So I'm going to put this out there. You guys can read what the CISA is and what they identified as workers. And you should actually be on front of calling people who are saying that these areas that are being included in this are often people who work in industries that are far beyond this. And I will tell you, I have seen a lot of things in manufacturing that really should be shut down under these things, but it's critical manufacturing, right? They have this sort of category out there that's opaque that people are using wrongly because, workers, businesses want to keep going. And I understand people need money, but this is being done at the cost of the virus, and that we need to recognize there's a real cost in this. So you'll have a chance to read that and see what you think of that. So I want to share that with you because I think that's important. So let's talk about Congress for a second. I really don't want to read this whole article, so I'm not going to. Other than to say, this is from CNN Politics, updated 6:15 a.m. Senate GOP ramps up pressure on Democrats over coronavirus stimulus package with a Monday vote. So hours after Democrats' black movement on a massive stimulus package Sunday evening, injecting fresh uncertainty about whether and when our lawmakers will reach a bipartisan deal to deliver relief amid the devastating coronavirus pandemic, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell ramped up the pressure on Democrats. And I've read all this before, enough to say. So suffice to say, they still haven't worked this out, that they literally are just throwing more and more money into the bill. So the bill currently looks like it's pressing towards $2 trillion. It doesn't look like it's going to really be adequate enough to take care of any of the needs of people beyond a very limited amount of time. So if this takes more than 30 days, people are going to be in big trouble. But it does have a lot of big bailouts and provisions for companies and stuff. And it has a lot of other policy pieces. Both the left and the right are saddling this with pork. Just one more example that they're not taking it very seriously. And I could go through individual provisions when we get an actual bill that's voted upon, because what we have now is not clear. What we have is people are dithering. We don't actually know, but we do know the Treasury Secretary is going to get like $500 billion to basically hand out to companies as it wants. That is not great. I don't think that's good. And, really it's more money going out there to business than it is to the people directly. And I understand there's an ideological component to that, but nonetheless, it's an ideological component that makes presumptions about getting out in front of the virus in a way that will expand the death toll. I think that's unconscionable, and I'm really disappointed with that level of thinking in the Congress. I hope that changes. I don't expect it to do so. And they continue to dither, and as they do, that hockey stick curve that we all know continues to get wider. So we'll leave that at that because it's too depressing to read this. I will read an analyst here talking. This is from CNBC. This is by Jeff Cox, published. It was actually updated at 6 p.m. yesterday. The government budget deficit is about to explode to fight the coronavirus. And let me give you a little preface of this, because as we go into this other section here, we spend a lot of time on Coronavirus Central, which, by the way, we thank you for listening to coronaviruscentral.net. We're an hour 46 in here, 9 a.m. on the East Coast, on the 23rd of March. We talk a lot about the economic consequences without getting too deeply into it. I know it's a topic that is of immense importance to everyone and perhaps not the most interesting thing to listen to ever. But suffice it to say, I'll give you the super short version, a little touch into history that might be relevant here, and then we're going to talk about the problem. Debt to income ratio, right? Something you understand from your house. If you're paying all your money on credit card bills, you're not going to be able to do very well. Or if you have a mortgage where you can't afford, if it takes up 100% of your income, you can't live well. Governments are no different. The debt to income ratio is the debt of the United States of America versus the gross domestic product. That's the sum accounting value of goods and services. Our debt is around $23 trillion, right? Our GDP is about 21.5 from what I've read. So call them the same just to make the math easier. Who cares about $1 trillion, right? Not in these times. Suffice it to say that we already owe more than we make in a single year. And we are about to blow that out of the roof with what's happening with coronaviruses, both from economic shortages, fiscal spending, as well as all these actions by the Fed, where they've basically just been rolling the presses, okay? So that's a problem you have, and that is going to cause a lot of issues with saying that the U.S. dollar may have major problems, and that's at the heart of what could cause a recession, depression, or even an economic collapse due to hyperinflation. You know, you could have currency be inflationary and you could have currency be inflationary, which is to say that it loses value because there's too much of it, at a time the economy itself is deflationary because you just aren't having the productive capacity. And so we need to talk about what the world order is, right? A lot of people are saying that the world is changing in ways that are very difficult to predict, and a lot of it goes back to the decisions that were made at the end of World War II. So let's go back to August 1945, and I think it's important so you understand that the world order that existed basically depended on four pieces that America basically enforced outside of the Soviet sphere, which was different but sort of contained. So there were four things. Number one is we were the world's biggest manufacturer. We built stuff so people had to listen. Everything else got wrecked in the war, right? Number two is we were the counterweight of the USSR. Presumably countries didn't want to be stuck in the Soviet sphere. Poland, other countries got given away to them after the war, whatever. But the rest of the world kind of went on to what we could call the American system that became the globalist system in time. Number three, the United States had the biggest ability for force projection at that point in the world. It was the only country that could, and this became expanded over time. It got much higher. But fourthly, and this is the more important one for what we're talking about, is that the world's reserve currency was the U.S. Because all these countries had to keep U.S. dollars, and all the countries of the world agreed to let the U.S. play the banker, ultimately, in the same way that a banker could cheat at a game of Monopoly, the U.S. could cheat at games around the world because every other country agreed America was the least objectionable option to sort of build the world system around. And in exchange for that, the U.S. set trade networks that frankly cost the United States citizens a lot of money, but did help rebuild the world and did provide for peace in a lot of ways which have value, as well as the fact they provided naval protection to facilitate global trade. So the idea, the whole theory of it was that the United States would give some of what it had, even though its people didn't know that was happening in a lot of ways, to lift up the rest of the world, and that led to globalization and all the various things that you've seen from the 60s, 70s onward, offshoring of businesses. Basically, it's a global distribution of wealth that happened in certain ways, but ultimately, it was done under the idea there was going to be a single global system evolving, and you could look at the UN as part of that. You could look at the World Bank as part of that, the Bank of International Settlements. Suffice it to say that the markets are all connected. There was an idea, it was big in the 90s, that two countries that had a McDonald's wouldn't fight one another. And World War II was an ugly, awful, brutal war that killed a whole bunch of people. And they didn't want to have that happen because people realized with the growth of technology, especially after the atomic bomb, a war between nations at that level would be so destructive. And in order to do that, U.S. was set to be in charge. Nonetheless, that was a very long time ago. We're talking about something 80 years ago now, 75 years ago. And things are changing again. The world is in a different place. And the system that made it possible for America to be the hegemon of the world is falling apart. Number one, we aren't the world's manufacturer. We are now the world's consumer, and that means instead of having products to sell, we have debt to consume. What will debt do for you in a crisis? We're starting to see in the coronavirus, not much. That we have the counterweight of the USSR. Well, Russia isn't the USSR, and China and the US have been working together economically for years, so those old struggles aren't the same, and so there isn't the sort of ability to come together. And you saw that in the aughts, in the fights between the U.S. and Europe over the various interventions in the Middle East. And why were we in the Middle East? Well, that has to do with the fact that when the U.S. dollar was set up as the world reserve currency, the U.S. dollar is backed by gold. Now the U.S. dollar is backed by oil. And so when you see those oil prices plummeting down into the 20s and below, what it means is that oil is cheap. Countries want to desperately get rid of it, and dollars become less valuable. In the short term, we're seeing a lot of people flee from stocks to the dollar. In the medium to long term, keep an eye on the dollar losing value. That's going to be a huge problem. And when you run debt up to the point where investors will not have the confidence, including sovereign investors, countries like China and Japan that own a lot of U.S. debt and who could dump that, we are now in a spot where the United States economy could be destroyed, and then all we're left with is our force projection capacity. We have a very big Navy, but we are overextended in many different countries. We're out there around the world doing these things, and Ultimately, we are left with force majeure, the ability to impose force. If those are removed, the global order, falls, and what you will see is that the global order that was thought to be between all these different nations was just one that was used. Whether it was China gaming the WTO, or people in Eastern European countries and the European Union getting more resources. All these countries did this, and now you're seeing revanchist nationalism come out, where people are looking at things differently. And China is not communism in the sort of Leninist track. They are state capitalism in service of the nationalist interest of Han Chinese. And that's just true. And the reason I'm going into all of this is because the U.S. has basically served as a plug on a volcano for a long time for a lot of different places. Russia looking at Ukraine, China looking at Taiwan, India and Pakistan looking at each other. And now that the U.S., all the pieces that were holding it together, the two that were gone were the fact that we were needed as the heavy against the USSR, not needed, and the world manufacturing. All we do is buy things, unto death, literally, we're seeing right now. So now we have these two different points left, which is one is that we have the dollar, which people are running to, but which is going to get killed by debt, and we have the ability to propose to force out there. So we're going to talk about the debt piece today, because I think if that begins to fall and the debt becomes too high and people, some of these sovereign states lose confidence, the U.S. economy can be functionally destroyed. And I don't know if that's going to happen. It's hard for other countries because they count on selling us things. These relationships are complicated. But if China decided they're not sending anything else to the U.S., and you see that sort of talking begin to happen, and that they're going to dump the U.S. debt, what will happen is the U.S. government, on top of the coronavirus epidemic, on top of the economic problems, is going to have a really big issue. We're going to get into why the economy is going to get so bad in a minute, but let's talk about the debt first, because that's already a huge problem. This is from CNBC. The government budget deficit is about to explode to fight the coronavirus. And this is from Jeff Cox, published at 6:23 yesterday evening. Congress and the White House are working on an economic stimulus bill likely to cost $2 trillion. The spending comes with the government is already expected to run a deficit $1 trillion per year. Economist Paul McCulley said aggressive spending to combat the coronavirus economic impact will be a bridge to the other side of an act of God. In addition to the spending, a Treasury backstop of Federal Reserve programs could provide another $4 trillion in liquidity. Administration officials say the spending will pave the way for greater growth later in the year. Remember when people were all worked up over trillion-dollar government budget deficits? Those might seem like the good old days once Congress and the White House finish up the coronavirus rescue package, expected to be approved in the next few days. Estimates of just how big the final bill would be will vary, but it's assured there will be a historic moment for sheer fiscal force being exerted at a time of economic duress. Administration statements over the past few days point to something on the order of $2 trillion in economic juice. By contrast, then-President Barack Obama ushered a $231 billion package through the financial crisis. And remember, just 2 weeks ago, President Trump was saying $8 billion was too much and that $2 billion would be enough. Keep in mind, look how fast this is growing, and we said that was going to happen. That because they're not addressing the problem, which is to solve defeating the coronavirus. But anyway, let's talk about what the cost is now of surviving this. That type of fiscal burden comes as the government has already chalked up $624.5 billion in red ink through just the first 5 months of the fiscal year, which started in October. That spending case extrapolated through the fiscal year would lead to a $1.5 trillion deficit, and that's aside from any spending to combat the coronavirus. Already, the national debt stands at more than $23.5 trillion and will be on track to eclipse $25 trillion. Taxpayers shelled out another $4.6 billion in fiscal 2019 and on interest payments for the debts. So literally, we are paying, just so you understand, $500 billion on debt payment, and another $229.1 billion in fiscal 2020. In short, the shock from COVID-19 will blow a fiscal hole through Washington, D.C. that could take years, if not decades, to patch. This is what happens in countries like Argentina. And it's important to remember the United States has another issue. And I'm going to put this out there, and I'll let you make of it what it will. The United States has many billions, maybe even trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities every year on the annual budget, which is to say that promises to provide social programs like Medicare, Medicaid, senior care programs, elderly programs, all these different programs that are guaranteed, where people are or have been living longer, and those costs have to be paid for, but the way they account for them is funny. So one of the things that some people cynically have noticed is that if old people are dying, the government saves a lot of money. So when you look at the response, I'm not accusing anyone of that, but I am pointing out the policy truth of that, realistically, it solves a big debt problem for the government to have a bunch of old people die at the same time you're having these issues happen, especially if those people are net recipients to the social networks as opposed to contributors, which is what happens in the course of life. I mean, the way that social welfare programs are usually structured is they help the very young, they take money from the people who are young and middle-aged, and then by the time you hit old age, you're supposed to draw out back from it. But the way things have worked with the allocation of assets have kind of made a mess of that. And so we have, with this unbalanced generations, we have a lot of old people drawing and not enough young people working and making enough money to cover it. And that's complicated why that works out that way. It'd be a longer conversation, but suffice it to say, older people have more assets and political power. So what tends to happen in America, and some people have noticed this, is we have something that you could call a gerontocracy, that old people often benefit at the expense of the young, and people who have resources benefit at the expense of those who do not. And, we have arguments over what the best way to deal with that is, but fundamentally, congressmen aren't that expensive to buy if you got a little bit of money. So, but in any case, leaving the politics, the structural politics aside, I wanted to let you see how big this is going to get, and we're going to talk about what that bridge looks like. Hand-wringing, this is from the CNBC article, hand-wringing over what this will all do to the debt and deficit situation, however, we'll have to wait for another day. In times of crisis, there is little patience for fiscal austerity, only a sense of urgency that while government spending can't stop the virus from spreading, which is not true, it can help somewhat, it can mitigate the profound economic damage. It's truly a bridge to the other side of an act of God, economist Paul McCulley told CNBC.com. We'll deal down the road with the impacts on so many fronts of society with the whole thing. Right now, worrying about fiscal incontinence is the exact opposite of where we should be. We should have fiscal robustness implemented through effectively a joint venture between fiscal and monetary policy. And you should keep an eye on this. Governments are more concerned about keeping the economy afloat, which is not a trivial concern, but I want you to note that point of emphasis. So when solutions come out and they don't make sense to you, this is what they're looking at. So you understand that they're more concerned about your behavior changing to try to survive the virus than they are about you surviving the virus, if that makes any sense. McCulley, a former managing director at asset management giant PIMCO and a Cornell University fellow and adjunct professor at Georgetown, has been one of the leading thinkers in economics, particularly since the financial crisis. He coined the term Minsky moment to describe sudden collapses in markets and shadow banking for non-bank lenders that were at the center of the crisis. He's an advocate of a philosophy that has taken more prominence over the past couple years called modern monetary theory. Essentially, the belief that debt and deficits matter less in times of low inflation and that government spending should be used to address the widened wealth gap in the U.S. as the Fed keeps interest rates low. Some of the biggest backers include Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio-Cortez. While the theory has some prominent detractors, such as economist Larry Summers, it is likely to become the de facto law of the land as the coronavirus economic impact intensifies. The Bank of the Uncle Sam needs to be open, period, McCulley said. And so what does this mean? They have a theory that you can print more money, and so long as people go ahead and honor it, even though it has no intrinsic value, we can all live the fantasy together. And which could maybe work. I'm not saying it wouldn't work under those circumstances. Here's your problem. For money to have value, people have to have faith in its purchasing power. For it to have purchasing power, you have to be able to buy goods and services. What does a quarantine with limited supply do? Reduce the flow of goods and services. So if you apply modern monetary theory, which could work under certain circumstances and is going to be tried, at the same time that you have resource scarcity, the division between finance and economics, that is finance being the way money works and economics being the way we get the things we need to survive, becomes so split that you can see a gap happen where money may lose value because people say, I don't want those dollars. They're not worth more to me than my can of beans. And this is sort of one of the things I'm worried about happening, and why we spend so much time in this show talking about supply chains, what that's going to mean, what will happen. And, ultimately, if the government wants to try this, the conclusion they're going to draw eventually, after getting it wrong for a while, if they keep it together, is they have to throw a lot of money at absolutely everyone to make it work, because otherwise you can't keep the quarantine, you can't restart the economy, and whatever these people believe about the severity of the virus, at this point no one's going to take chances they don't have to, especially as it continues to get worse. This is the crisis you need to watch, where if you see the dollar start going down in trading, because it's hard, you can't see it against other currencies, but you'll see it in terms of how it goes against goods. If you're going to the supermarket and goods start to double and triple in price, that's the tell you need to keep an eye on. That's where you see the dollar's on its way to runaway inflation. And if that happens, in light of all the other geopolitical things we talked about, you might see the collapse of the sort of American economic world-based system, and other countries may decide to go ahead and hasten that. China can do a lot to do harm, so can Japan. Will they do it? Who knows? Could they do it? Yes. And do they have reason to do that? Well, we're going to talk about that later this week, but I would argue they do. Okay, so what the spending will look like. Making that happen would take a variety of forms. Macaulay sees programs run jointly between the Treasury and Federal Reserve as key, with the central bank expected to keep interest rates flowing and liquidity programs running. Saying that too much central bank independence can be a problem is something that's considered heretical in my profession, he said. That's essentially what I'm saying now. This week's stimulus is projected to be a combination of direct deposit payments to individuals, extended unemployment benefits to the millions who will be displaced from the retrenchment of activity due to social distancing and business closings, and our bridge loans to the businesses that will be incentivized not to lay off workers. Keep in mind, they're trying to keep the economy afloat. They don't really care as much about the people getting sick, and the problem is that way of thinking means you're going to have 10, 20, 30% of people who are permanently unemployed, don't have money, can't get resources. And what are those people going to do? They're going to forage, they're going to scavenge, they're going to go out there, they're going to spread the virus. And ultimately, those are your consumers, also. It's not just as simple as that. So if you don't have an overall solution, and they really don't, because they're looking at it from a productive capacity rather than as a understanding the virus's impact on the economy in terms of what it's doing to human psychological behavior. This is one of the problems that happens. People look at economics as a function of finance rather than a function of behavior, and I would argue strongly that that's wrong. And we're going to see if my estimations have been based on this theory from the beginning, and we'll see if I'm right or they're right. I mean, you better hope they're right, but the track record's not in their favor, because it'll be easier if they're right, and I hope they, there's problems with hoping they are too. But suffice it to say that, they need to get enough supplies and people so that everyone can buy into the fantasy. Because the minute a little kid starts laughing at the emperor for having no clothes, everyone will begin admitting the obvious, and that's just the way these things work. So if we're going to have a fantasy, and Lord knows that's about what they're going to try, everyone needs to go ahead and get their piece of the pie, which will be a really interesting world, because then everyone will have money and no one will theoretically have to work. And that has other problems, which are very, very big, which is another reason I don't think this will work, because then you really won't have incentives for people to go out there and do work. All right, let me just see here where we were. Okay, on top of that, the Treasury will offer guarantees to the Fed that Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin will allow the central bank to leverage up to $4 trillion of liquidity for the business and financial system. That's they get free loans. The total price tag, unimportant, at least as long as the nation suffers through an indefinite near shutdown. The dude who is unemployed now gets check and has gotten himself an asset that he can cash and go into a store, Macaulay said. He's got an asset, but Uncle Sam has gone into a hole. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Still, there will be efforts to calculate the fiscal damage. And the next subheading is most debt since World War II. Moody's Investor Service has been warning about deficit issues for some time and said Friday its previous scenarios are likely to look worse as government spending accelerates. We previously projected that adverse fiscal dynamics would increase the deficit to around 6.3% of GDP by 2029, but the coronavirus pandemic introduces significant downside risk to our medium-term fiscal outlook. Moody's analyst Gabriel Agostini said in a report. On the revenue front, a coronavirus-induced slowdown will remove workers from the payrolls and weaken federal revenue tax revenue intake. And they're going to move that apparently to July 15th. So if you're worried about paying your taxes, that's out there for you. Combined with large sums of federal spending to support the economy, we expect the U.S. fiscal deficit to rise to levels not seen since the 2008 global financial crisis, driving debt higher, he added. Agostini noted that low borrowing costs will help alleviate some of the burden. The Fed a week ago slashed its benchmark interest rate to near zero, and Treasury yields have been in historically low territory. But the fiscal balance sheet will still look worse than it has since World War II. During the financial crisis, the budget deficit as share of GDP hit a high of 9.8%. Prior to that, the only worst period came during the war when the level hit 26.9 in 1943. A $2 trillion deficit, which seems conservative given the current scenario, would push deficit to 9.4%. A $3 trillion shortfall, which seems like not much of a stretch, would take the level to 14%. And if it gets as bad as we're predicting as opposed to them, you can see that number is only going to get higher and push towards World War II-like levels, which is where a lot of these things came up with. Of course, the numbers are all fungible, and Mnuchin told Fox News he expects short-term damage to the economy followed by gigantic growth in the fourth quarter of 2020. The administration efforts, though, are more geared to what's happening now. As fiscal policy loosens, the deficit does increase quite substantially in the near term, said Jeremy Lawson, chief economist at Aberdeen Standard Investments. If the government isn't filling that gap in the period where the private sector is retrenching, it effectively doubles the size of the economic shock that's taking place. So what they're saying is that the government's having to step in and basically fake the economy until business can come back from the coronavirus. There are going to be major consequences to that, both in terms of the behaviors people expect as well as what businesses do and what the money's going to mean afterwards. I mean, we are really going to have a different thing if they can keep it together, and that's a really big if. But he notes, in fact, Lawson said that monetary and fiscal authorities will probably have to step up their efforts. He said that while the Fed needs to get more aggressive, because while it might feel they're throwing the kitchen sink at this, at the moment you'll say they're only throwing the tap. So as the shock of trillion-dollar deficits will now give way to the shock of multi-trillion-dollar deficits, there's little else for authorities to do except keep pumping. By using your balance sheet during the bad times, what you can actually do is help the long-term health of the budget by assuring there is an economy that can return when the private sector is able to start spending again. Then the fiscal authority can unwind that stimulus, the temporary parts of it. Lawson said, yes, it's like blowing a hole in a budget, but that's probably necessary to keep a bigger one from being blown open later on. They know that this may or may not work, and they're trying to project confidence. Will it work? Will it not work? I don't know. I tell you what, it hasn't been tried, and it's asking a lot. And if you come through this and you're going to say, okay, equity is going to be a big question, because if everyone's going to play a game, right, and that's what we're doing with our economy now, we're playing a game, everyone has to agree that they're going to play by the same rules. And if you start a game and you tell one person, well, you're going to start Monopoly with $5,000, but this guy will only start with $1,000, be like, well, it's all fake anyway, but yeah, but we were ahead before. Now, the person on top could think that's fair, but if the other 5 people say, we're not going to play that game, especially after they've been getting paid, and let's say that we get to the point, like I'm expecting, where we're going to have checks through this, and you get people in the habit of getting a $2,000 check every day, and you take that away, I guarantee you there's going to be a big political lobby that's going to want to see that changed. And the instability of politics that comes in an economy that doesn't work well is going to see this country move in a more collectivist direction. I mean, we can balance those things with rights, but I mean, it's just the reality. The virus forces that. And keep in mind, we're only talking about this in a 3-month window. What happens if we have 18 months and we have a second wave of a virus or a mutated strain where we get to go through this again in October? These are very real possibilities that we're not even considering in these sort of glossy scenarios. You see why I worry about the economy. I'm not the only one. This piece is from Market Watch. That's one of the big places that covers, marketwatch.com, what's happening worldwide with the markets. This is from March 22nd, 2020 at 6:52 p.m. And this is from the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the St. Louis branch, which is essentially the national bank. His name is James Bullard. And this was published yesterday. Unemployment could reach 30% in the U.S., says St. Louis Fed's Bullard. And you should listen when the Fed talks, because they're the ones who actually make the decisions in this country usually. So This is a planned, organized, partial shutdown of the U.S. economy in the second quarter. The overall call is to keep everyone, households, and businesses whole. It is a huge shock, and we are trying to cope with it and keep under control. So they're trying to just pause things and keep things in place. Can they do it? It depends on scarcity. In any case, that's what Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis President James Bullard, explaining to Bloomberg News, said why he sees the U.S. unemployment rate hitting 30% in the coming months as the world continues to grapple with the coronavirus pandemic. If his gloomy jobs projection proves true, then unemployment would be worse than it was during the Great Depression and 3 times worse than in the 2007-2009 recession, according to Reuters. He also expects an unprecedented 50% plunge in gross domestic product. If that's the case and we go down to, let's call it $12 trillion at $25 trillion debt, we'll have twice the amount of debt that we have to that. And so the way we manage that debt is by saying that, okay, you're going to go ahead, we're going to sell this like bonds to the public, but who's buying them? Sovereign countries are, because they have faith the U.S. is going to make it. Let's say China starts dumping their bonds. Japan dumps their bonds. There's like a couple $1 trillion there, I think. What will happen is everyone will sell. The dollar ends up useless. And this is what happened in the Great Depression, that you ended up having sovereign debt proving worthless. So what the government had to do was they printed themselves out of deficits. They printed the money. People decided the money was worthless, and the situation went to crap. And the only way it got out of it is that people literally went to war to take other people's assets. This is why a lot of times war can follow these sort of deficits. But I'm hoping it doesn't go this way. I'm just telling you the history so you have context. Because we grow up thinking that the world is a different place and we live in a time of peace and prosperity where everyone gets along. No, we happen to live in one of those weird times like the Pax Romana. 90% of history is people killing each other because they want other people's stuff. This is the reality of it. You're welcome to go research it if you want and see if you can draw a different conclusion. That we may be going into more difficult times like this, which is why I put the emphasis on you protecting your family so we can come out of this with hopefully something less bad than my sort of dire Mad Max predictions I make from time to time. Because we all want it to be better, but we have to solve problems one at a time. Having 30% of the people unemployed, 50% of the people gross domestic product gone, that's the economy, would shut down so many businesses. The stock market would be shot. Companies would shutter. And that might happen anyway. So what happens? How do you get food around? Well, the government can just give it to you, which is what they might have to try to do. But if they can't do that, what's going to happen? Well, people are going to go look for what they need anywhere they can get it. That's why we focus on the supply chain every single day, because that's the important question. Can they do it? I don't know. We're going to find out. Let's see. Everything is on the table, Bullard said, referring to additional lending programs from the Federal Reserve. There's more we can do if necessary. There's probably much more in the months ahead, depending on where Congress wants to go. With the appropriate measures, Bullard says he's looking for activity to rebound quickly. I would see the third quarter as a transitional quarter, with the following 6 months quite robust as Americans ramp up consumerism. Those quarters might be boom quarters, he said. Well, they might be, or they might be, like the federal government said, we might be dealing with 18 months of this virus. If we get hit once, they might survive. If we get hit a second time, I don't think they do. I don't think the economy survives as is, and I don't know what that means. I can only tell you the problems I see, not the solutions that will emerge on the other side of it. I can just say if you think of basic needs for yourself, you can begin anticipating what problems will have to be solved. So I want to share a piece with you. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's a fascinating piece, but it's long, and we're already 2 hours, 14 minutes in. Thank you for listening. Sorry to be putting out long shows. I know some of you love them. I know some of you can't get to everything. I took the weekend off so I could give you the information you need, talking about America and some of the death issues today as we look at coronavirus, and we're going to take a closer look at Europe and other foreign countries tomorrow, absent any earth-shattering news, which is always a possibility. But this piece is from goldseek.com. It sort of looks at things in a hard money sense, but I wanted to include it. How a debt jubilee in mining could be the path to coronavirus recovery. And there's a long argument about what's happening and what's necessary, but a debt jubilee is suggested here, as well as an infrastructure bailout. And basically says this: government says we're going to erase all the debts. Everyone agrees to go ahead and hit the reset button. And then you have an infrastructure buyout. Maybe you put it with a new Homestead Act. Imagine everyone owns their homes so that people are free of debt. You could maybe put 95% of the people at a restart position. This used to happen in ancient history. It hasn't been tried recently, and it's not going to be popular with the banks because they control the world through debt. Nonetheless, it is an alternate model that would be suggestible. And I want to go ahead and I'm going to read the conclusion to this because I think it's interesting about what he wants to talk about. It's really worth reading about how this puts out there. It's really based in rebuilding the economy on the fundamentals while freeing people out from toxic debt, including the government. But it requires us to think very differently. So the conclusion of this piece here. The recovery from the Great Recession was impressive. It set up the longest expansion in U.S. history, 126 months of economic growth. The stock market bull many thought would keep going has finally died. The coup de grace delivered with stunning efficiency by the coronavirus. Among COVID-19's most obvious economic impacts are disruptions to global supply chains, demand destruction, especially for discretionary items like cars, air travel, and real estate, and threats to employment as firms are forced to either lower production or close factories, stores, or warehouses, laying people off. But the biggest effect, one some, including us, have seen coming, is the debt problem, which is finally coming home to roost. As Jayati Ghosh writes in Project Syndicate, even if the pandemic's economic impact is contained, it may have already set the stage for a debt meltdown long in the making. Today's financial fragility far predates the COVID-19 black swan. Given the massive accumulation of debt in both developed and developing countries since the 2008 financial crisis, it has long been clear that even a minor event, some known unknown, could have far-reaching destabilizing effects. Yet, until recently, rising asset prices owing to a long period of extraordinarily loose monetary policies and advanced economies disguised mounting debt levels. Basically, they made money cheap so that people could get access to it, and since they could get access to it, even though it wasn't real, it was all based on debt that couldn't be paid later, like a credit card that was going to be paid off, like some of you may have run up, like I did, quite frankly. You would be seeing this. It was hiding the fact that ultimately someone has to balance the books at some points. So here's their suggestion. We and others have been warning about this for quite a while. The market meltdown is like watching a slow-motion car crash, and our fear is that debt will strangle any attempts at economic recovery. Of the latter, we are not impressed with what we are seeing from central banks, who seem to believe that all it will take is another big shot of liquidity chased down with more interest rate cuts. How do 0% interest rates help the average person not invested in the stock market? How does the IMF loaning developing countries more money and putting them even further in debt help their impoverished citizens? How does it help people hunkered down in their homes, hoarding groceries, worried about their jobs, paying the rent, or covering the heating bill? We propose a more radical course of action. First, we need to beat the coronavirus to help the millions of people who could catch it and die from it, which, according to Hong Kong's leading epidemiologist, could infect 60% of the world's population if unchecked and kill 45 million people. And that is a low estimate. That's a really low estimate, to be honest with you. Next is a global debt reset, a debt jubilee, if you will. Imagine what could happen if all the central banks acted together in retiring all of the world's debt. All $244 trillion of government, corporate, consumer loans. Of course, the financial institutions would balk. Their hand would need forcing. But the effects on the economy would be immediate and profound. Third, give every U.S. and Canadian citizen $50,000 worth of helicopter money. That's just saying money to bail you out and lift you up. Now consider, if Trump, Trudeau, and other world leaders really want to pull the global economy out of its funk and set growth back on the fast track, they will implement a global infrastructure build-out. We suggest they take their cues from China. It's not been widely reported, but China has beaten the coronavirus. Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's fine. Quarantining millions of people has worked to stop its spread. The government's focus has shifted from containing the virus to rebuilding the Chinese economy. So if we can beat this, these things are out there. He's a little premature, but the project thinking is smart. Part of its stimulus plan is to bolster growth, mainly through infrastructure spending. It is anticipated that Beijing will inject up to $570 billion into the economy, mostly on infrastructure projects. Among the projects that could receive a huge boost of investment, courtesy of a government rescue package, are $44.2 billion expansion of Shanghai's urban rail transit system, an intercity railway along the Yangtze River, and 8 new metro lines worth $21.7 billion to be constructed in the virus epicenter of Wuhan. China's planned $500 million infrastructure spend is a very good news for base metals, including copper. So the most simple and effective way to offset the epidemic and economic downturn remains infrastructure construction. It can stabilize growth, employment, unleash growth potential, and improve long-term competitiveness. So that's a lot like the New Deal was during FDR, the Tennessee Valley Authority and things like that. There's a long history of doing this, and America, in fact, has participated in that, where it did lift up a lot of people out of poverty. In any case, said Xi Jinping, the chief economist for China Evergrande, China's main property developer and a former researcher with the development researcher of the State Council, quoted in the South China Morning Post. The rest of the world has much to gain by emulating a huge infrastructure build-out as part of a global fix to the coronavirus shock. The only problem is coming up with the metals to do it. However, with the right guidance, this could be a monumental, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the mining industry to step up and provide steady employment for thousands of people for years as new mines develop to meet demand not only for infrastructure, but the industries of the future. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, and copper are examples of in-demand metals that would be required in large volumes for the new electrified economy. But remain dependent on external, potentially hostile countries for these metals is not such a great idea. In fact, there's no way the U.S. will be able to correct its infrastructure deficit through domestic mining. A large percentage will have to be imported. The only way to break this dependence is for funding to return to junior resource companies that can go out and do on-the-boots exploration. Major mining companies play a key role in assessing upcoming projects and purchasing the properties and/or the companies that will bring them closer to their goal of replacing depleting reserves and growing production. The coronavirus is the perfect opportunity to reset the global monetary system through the debt jubilee, setting the stage for massive increase in consumer spending and government investment in infrastructure projects that will ensure the development of the next generation of great minds. And that's by Richard Mills. So here's what it comes down to in the economy. You can save the banks or you can save the people. And that's what it's going to come down to. I'm oversimplifying that massively, but there's a reason why I'm banned from PayPal, and it's not just because I don't attack people who look like me. I've been a critic for the banks for many years. I worked for Ron Paul in 2007 during his campaign. I was heavily involved with End the Fed, Occupy Wall Street. I also participated in some of those things, just to give you a little bit of background, because ultimately we spend our lives going away to debt. And we either will continue to be in servitude to debt, which is what this economic solution kind of contemplates, or we're going to have to find something different. And if we don't find something different, we will end up there one way or another, because I don't think this system can hold through. But we're going to talk about debt. We're going to talk about this financing, and I'm not saying what the outcomes need to be other than this. You can't ask people to essentially return to serfdom, which is kind of what we're doing, actually, with how, think about it. Like, you go, indentured servitude, right? You go to college these days, right? And you could say you don't have to go to college, and that's true, but people do that because they want to advance. In the 60s, you'd go to college, and you could pay for it with a summer job. You could pay for an Ivy League school. Now you're stuck paying until you're 40 years old. You could buy a house with half a year's income. Now you're stuck paying for it for 30 years plus, 40 years in some cases. You're paying huge amounts of interest. Why do we do that? Well, because people own things and we pay them debts. We do it because of compound interest. It's really that simple. So you can either make the banks rich and we can all suffer and we can do these things, right? Or we could do things differently. And there's a lot of different ways you could do it differently. But the virus is going to make everything pause anyway. A thought that I think more people should embrace is saying that, why do things on the other side of this need to be the way they were before? Maybe you could do a debt jubilee. Maybe you say, hey, wherever you live, you own that house, you own that apartment, you own that. There would be winners and there would be losers. But instead of having, I think I remember reading, the top 300 families have like 50% of the wealth in this world, we could have something that's a little fairer. And in America, we've done that before, where we've kind of had a blue-collar boom, and you get people out from debt, and you want to have people consume things. When they get to the other side of this, tell them you own your house. Imagine how much money you would save in your house if you didn't have to pay for rent or, a house. And I know there'd be people who'd be mad, and you can find ways to make people whole. I'm sure you could do that. There's different ways you could do it. I don't know what all these answers are, but these are the conversations you're going to eventually get to on the other side of this, because after a while, we're all going to have to sit here, we're all going to have to watch, or we're going to have to go out there and die. Most people, I assume, will make the rational decision. They will not go out there and die, and they will go ahead and they will decide that they're going to sit back and they're going to see this fall apart. And as they do, if too many people die, if too many people can get resources, if the government begins to lose control, we'll have all these problems. How do you get ahead of these? You have to be able to make enough people whole. This is a way to start having that conversation. It's not necessarily the right answer. It's just a different way to think about the problem. The alternative is more like what China did. It's a more authoritarian solution. It's something that's much stronger in terms of forcing what people have to do. It's something the government will probably support in some ways, because the idea that you have a command and control structure is going to be good. to them and thinking that they can maintain the old ways. And I think specifically with what we're dealing with in this crisis, it will prove incredibly appealing because people will want strong leadership. And that has been lacking. We've continued having our leaders ask us how to solve the problem. When you start seeing that die-off number go up into the 4, 5, 6 figures every day, potentially, which is horrible, but it could actually happen in the worst-case scenario, I think people will be willing to contemplate things like that. And so with respect to that, what I want to show you here is a piece, this is from Newsweek that came out, and it was talking about what the military's plans are if coronavirus cripples the government. This is the alternate way we may approach this problem. I mean, there's 3 different ways. There's a thoughtful solution, there's a collapse scenario, and there is the military solution. So let's take a look at it. So I'm going to read this article, and this will be the last one for today, but I'll give you a feel for what the other alternative looks like. This is from Newsweek by William M. Arkin, and it was published on the 20th at 12:30 p.m. Inside the U.S. military's plans to stop civil disturbances amid coronavirus pandemic, something they haven't done in 30 years. Okay. With the National Guard now active in 22 states and governors continuing to declare more severe emergency measures daily, the U.S. military is preparing forces to assume a larger role in the coronavirus response, including the controversial mission of quelling civil disturbances and enforcing the law, a mission the military has not engaged in for almost 30 years. Within military circles, opinion is split over whether federal forces should muscle their way in to do more. State governors and their respective National Guard units, not the federal government and the active duty military, are primarily responsible for handling domestic emergencies. That's the law, and it's also common sense, since local officials are always closer to a crisis and generally more familiar with the people affected. The civil disturbance mission requires a deft hand that men and women who have been in battle might not have, and some question whether soldiers are trained or appropriate. The Pentagon contingency plan for dealing with civil disturbances also does not anticipate any scenario like coronavirus, where widespread deployment would thrust more responsibility into the hands of low-level commanders on the scene. There, military insiders say the policies governing when federal troops can intervene and when they can use force are skewed toward absolutes more appropriate for a foreign battlefield. Acknowledging that the most difficult question ahead is what role the military will play in keeping order in America, on Thursday, Air Force General Joseph Lingle, head of the National Guard Bureau, cautioned against federalizing the state-based National Guard, which would rob them of their unique legal authorities to conduct law enforcement missions. Though Lingle says there have been no requests yet to use the National Guard for law enforcement, he made an argument that the states keep decisions at their level out of federal hands, touting the 450,000-man strong National Guard is ready when their governors call. But planners involved at the Pentagon and U.S. Northern Command, while admitting the National Guard is the best choice if there's a public breakdown, also say the Guard may not be able to be relied upon, not just because of the scope of need, but because it is a citizen force spread out across America, and it thus is as susceptible to the rest of the general population as contracting the virus. A senior military planner working on coronavirus but not authorized to speak on sensitive planning matters says the deployment of federal troops in support roles is being prepared. This week, the Pentagon allocated 2 Navy hospital ships to coronavirus duty, one in New York and the other in California. Other logistics and engineering missions are also being prepared. Those support missions are partially intended to free up National Guard troops so they can conduct law enforcement if necessary, with active duty forces operating in the background. But once military forces are dispersed off bases in America, the senior planner says, they will have to contend with force projection and will be thrust into difficult general law enforcement roles, particularly as shelter-in-place and other quarantine situations escalate. Rumors of a nationwide lockdown spread through social media this week, and Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden said he would mobilize military forces now to respond to coronavirus. And while tamping down the fear of martial law, California Governor Gavin Newsom said, though it wasn't called for or necessary, if you want to establish a framework of martial law, which is the ultimate authority and enforcement, we have the capacity to do that. Martial law involves use of the military to exercise police powers, restore and maintain order, assure essential mechanics of distribution, transportation, and communication, and conduct necessary relief measures, an Army manual published last July says. The doctrine, however, is contradictory on the question of who can order martial law. In one place, it says that only the president may order federal military forces to impose martial law, and on another page it says other officials may be authorized to impose martial law within a particular state under that state's law. In either case, the doctrine says federal military commanders shall not take any change of function of civil government unless necessary under conditions of extreme emergency. And if you want to see what that is, it's called continuity of government. It's sort of your worst case scenario, and it's a mess. And it states any commander who is directed, who undertakes or controls such functions, shall limit military actions to the emergency needs and facilitate the reestablishment of civil responsibility at the earliest time possible. When asked to comment, the former commander of NORTHCOM told Newsweek, "It's unfortunate that talk of defense support of civil authorities, civil disturbance operations, and martial law are contained in the same documents. We certainly don't want to muddy the waters by suggesting that martial law is easy or continuum. Even making the basic decision to enforce the law is momentous." U.S. Northern Command, located in Colorado Springs, wrote its first contingency plan for civil disturbance operations called Con Plan 3502 in 2007. The classified plan, hundreds of pages long, describes a broad set of tasks where military forces could be called to assist civil authorities in response to civil disturbances. These include, quote, riots, acts of violence, insurrections, unlawful obstructions or assemblages, group acts of violence, and disorders prejudicial to public law and order, according to one study. Though the plan includes a broad listing of conditions where federal forces might be used, it also assumes a single location or region and posits a maximum force, the Level 3 force of Army Corps personnel of some 20 to 36,000 people. NORTHCOM was specifically directed to be ready to respond for assistances from states and local authorities in June 2018, the senior planner said, but none of the contingency planning mentioned a pandemic of this size or ever anticipated a nationwide deployment might occur. What would trigger, and we talked about this actually, that that the U.S. planning always assumes to be acting in one or two places, not everywhere at once with everyone already committed. I mean, this is really an act of God type level we have to deal with. What would trigger the use of force in civil disturbance operations derives mostly from the experience of Hurricane Katrina. During the response in New Orleans, Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco refused Bush administration's insistence that she accede to federalizing her guard forces, fearing that she would lose control. Though President George W. Bush could have invoked the law to force federalization and authorize Army troops to enforce the law given the nature of the emergency, the White House backed down, deploying forces but without any police powers. The use of federal military forces in the enforcement of the law as a posse comitatus or group summoned by the local sheriff has long been prohibited unless otherwise authorized by specific laws passed by the Congress. In Con Plan 3502, there are references to three exceptions. The use of the military in the war on drugs, in extraordinary circumstances involving weapons of mass destruction. Keep in mind, if this is a bioweapon, this would apply. And third, in the enforcement of the Laws to Restore Public Order Act, also confusingly known as the Insurrection Act. According to NORTHCOM, federal troops could be used to enforce the law in cases when rebellion against the authority of the U.S. makes it impracticable to enforce the laws of the U.S. by ordinary course of judicial proceedings. Imagine people can't get food in Baltimore, to use an example, and they're rioting like crazy. The military, the governor's gone, the police have skipped town, the National Guard aren't going in there. You might see the feds go in. That's an example we could see. Under the Insurrection Act, Con Plan 3502 says if violence could not be brought under control by state and local law enforcement agencies and the state National Guard, the president may use the National Guard called into federal service, the reserves when called to active duty, and members of the armed forces to enforce federal laws or suppress an insurrection. The president may use the armed forces or the federal National Guard, the plan says, to make arrests, conduct searches, and perform other traditional law enforcement functions if needed to suppress any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy. The conditions are not unlimited, as even there under the Insurrection Act, the use of federal forces is supposed to be justified if civil violence or disruption so hinders the execution of state and federal law that people are deprived of their rights secured by the Constitution and law. These conditions, the enforcement of federal law, don't apply to the current situation, the senior planner says. The president can determine that the situation exceeds either the capabilities or willingness of the local authorities to restore law and order, he says, but the very language, the inclusion of the willingness clause, shows how much the contingency planning was still written for yesterday's crises and not applicable to the coronavirus. Willingness was included, the planner says, because of the legacy of troops being used in the enforcement of civil rights. The imposition of federal force is often at odds with the wishes of state and local officials. in response to Hurricane Katrina and to take into consideration broader circumstances that might force the federal military to enforce the law, Congress enacted significant changes to the Insurrection Act in October 2006, broadening the president's authority to employ the armed forces domestically without state request or consent. That change added as a result of a natural disaster, epidemic, or other serious public health emergency, terrorist attack or incident, or other condition in any state where the president determined that domestic violence has, and they don't mean people in the home, they mean literally people committing violent acts in the streets, has occurred to such an extent that the constituted authorities of the state or possession are incapable of maintaining public order. These changes were met by widespread resistance from state governors. In the following year, Congress repealed the change, reverting to previous language. Con Plan 3502 was modified in 2009 to reflect the original language of the Insurrection Act, adding instead provision for the use of federal enforcers to enforce the law in response to public health emergencies, but at the same time placing more onus on local commanders. If federal forces are called upon to enforce the law, the senior planner says, a lot more responsibility will be put on the shoulders of low-level commanders on the scene. As it stands today, if they face a breakdown of civil authority or outright violence against themselves, Con Plan 3502 is not much help. The commander's decision to take action must be always based on necessity rather than convenience to either the military commander or civil authorities. Army doctrine written last July states, the doctrine says that under rare circumstances, a commander may take prompt action, including direct law enforcement duties as the circumstances reasonably justify. Another Pentagon directive released in 2019 instructs commanders to, quote, engage temporarily in activities that are necessary to quell large-scale, unexpected civil disturbances, even if they have no prior authorization to do so. Commanders can enforce the law, the directive says, when necessary to prevent significant loss of life or wanton destruction of property and to restore public order. And still another Pentagon directive issued a month later in March 2019 when dealing with public health emergencies authorizes military commanders to impose quarantine, isolation, and conditional release and says those who violate such orders may face fine or imprisonment. Those individuals or groups not subject to military law and who refuse to obey or otherwise violate an order issued in accordance with this issuance may be detained by the military commander until appropriate civil authorities can respond, the directive says. Yes, military commanders have the right of self-defense, the former NORTHCOM commander says upon reading these new doctrines and directives, and they can obviously take action in an emergency, but maybe it's still not appropriate on the streets of America. The senior planner agrees, saying it is incumbent on the Pentagon to provide specific orders and rules of engagement for the coronavirus. I'm just not sure, as good as they are, our troops can be ready for something as widespread and explosive as COVID-19, the planner says. At the same time, he worries that the presence of uniformed personnel in the streets of America, rather than providing comforting presence, will just signal the use of federal force and martial law, just making the situation worse. So that's what the quarantine option looks like. It's a mess, and that's why they don't want to touch it, and why you see the federal government is very carefully going into this, because in addition, we can talk about this from the virus perspective and all the problems. We have to stop it or we die. We can talk about from the economic perspective. If goods and services don't move and we die, then we riot. But we can talk about it from the civil unrest perspective, which is you got, like we talked about in Seattle earlier, we got all these people who don't want to be told what to do. You got 40% of the people that will riot if you do try to do what's necessary. So whatever the government picks, it's kind of screwed. And that's the problem with understanding this whole issue. We try to focus our efforts more on the virus on this show. And I know I ran very late today. We're up on 2 hours, 40 minutes here. But I did that because you need to understand why they're doing what they're doing. Because if you understand why a person does things, you can begin predicting what will happen. So what do we predict? The government eventually will have to impose more order than it wants to because people are not doing what's necessary to stop the virus. As they do that, it hurts the economy more, which will make people more panicked and more nervous. They're going to need a big solution to stop that. You're not seeing that coming from Washington. There are things they could do, but given that they can't do the things policy-wise that would make sense because they don't have a vision of the scope of problem, what they probably will do is what government tries to do, like they do with this podcast. They'll control information, try to shut things down, and eventually you will be seeing pushes, and I suspect we'll see an example in some state first, where a state governor puts out their National Guard to keep people at home, and we'll see what happens when people offer resistance. If it works out like it is in Ohio, where they acted quickly and the National Guard's delivering food, it may be very friendly. If not, you could have something that looks like all those terrible scenes out of the 60s or earlier, where you had these huge fights, and those things happen in countries. There have been happening in France with the yellow vest, and it's a real problem, something you need to be aware of. So what do you do to get through this? Use the little bit of time you have now to stock up your supplies. Make sure you top off everything you need. Try to keep your long-term supplies in the long-term area. And just follow the news. I mean, this is going to move very quickly, but perhaps not quickly enough, because at the heart of this, like we said, in New York now, 1 in 1,000 people appear to have been exposed to this virus. That spread 2 in 1,000, 3 days from now. 4 in 1,000, 6 days from now. 8,000, 9 days from now. You can see it's just going to go 16,000, 32,000 2 weeks from now. And that's how much time they want to wait and see what's going to happen. Okay, well, we can wait. Or 320,000. I'm sorry, I took off a whole number of magnitude there. You can see how the numbers progress very quickly. We're going to deal with that. So what will we pray for today? Heavenly Father, I just pray that we have a vision that will guide us to truth so that we can avoid the worst of this, that not only those people who get sick from the coronavirus be safe, but the people who are sick from other conditions who we don't forget in this time, and for the people who would be a harm if we have a system, and there have been many times throughout history where we've gone ahead and done something where we went back to the people and we went back to working and seeking a higher truth rather than how we can have relationships between each other governed by money rule things. Let's look for different solutions now and hope that your wisdom can guide us, that we can find a way out of this where this terrible epidemic and pandemic can be mitigated to the greatest extent possible, that wisdom will come and conscientiousness to those who are not acting that way, who are putting people at risk through their actions, and that we may all survive in peace and prosperity on the other side of this to seek your truth. In Jesus' name, amen. It's a lot to process. We'll talk more about it on the show tonight at 7 p.m. Come on to YouTube. We are available always at coronaviruscentral.net, corona.castos.com/feed if you want to load it into any podcast. Some people who want to send support, now when I complain about banks why I can't do electronic stuff, P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction, Maine, 04442, 3 4s in there if I said one too many. And the show's on YouTube, it's on iTunes, it's on Google Play, and we'll always have it up for you one way or another. You might have to look a little harder, but hey, you're going to have to learn that anyway as we go through this crisis. So you guys all have a very good day. This has been Tom Kaczynski, Coronavirus Central. God bless.